when a murder is discovered.
It was a female who had her head and her hands removed. And she had been found in what can be described as like a duffel bag. And she had her wrist and her ankles bound.
It doesn't just destroy one life.
I don't think he's capable of loving people, because how do you kill your own children? That was the last thing those children saw, was their dad killing them. How do you do that?
It tears communities apart.
When her body was located, she was nude, she was deceased, she had some ligature marks on her neck.
It's up to the police to not only solve the mystery.
The fact that he could go home and look into the eyes of his son, knowing that he had murdered his mother, is just horrific to consider.
And track down the killer, but bring them to justice.
There's 2 bodies found. Your first thought is, oh my goodness me, is there a serial killer?
In this episode, an 84-year-old man is found strangled to death in his own home.
It must have been very traumatic for her to have found her father in such a manner.
Meet the murder detectives.
It had guns missing, so that there's an element of danger to everybody, to the public.
Who reveal how they caught the killer.
With strangulation, it's not instant. You literally have to be strangling them and watching their life ebb away.
In the affluent area of Ramsgate, in the southeast of England, an 84-year-old man is found dead in the living room of his home.
I got the call about a suspicious death in a house in Park Road, Ramsgate, end of November 1996. There's lots of things that go through your mind when you receive a phone call such as that, and of course, first thing is to make sure that the scene is preserved.
Detective Superintendent Nick Biddis was appointed Senior Investigating Officer. The victim was identified as Kenneth Speakman, a retired town clerk.
Mr. Speakman was found by his daughter late in the evening, and as a result of obviously being unable to contact her father. It must have been very traumatic for her to have found her father in such a manner. Well, this is Park Road, Ramsgate. It's actually quite an affluent little area. It's nice houses, mainly detached, some terraced houses. And this is the house of Mr. Speakman, where I attended on the morning in November and was confronted with the crime scene. When I got into the front room, the body was laying on the floor and he was laying face down. It was evidence that he'd been attacked and strangled and he was dead. And of course I then went round the house looking for anything that might obviously be stolen. It was self-evident that this was more than just a suspicious death, it was a murder.
Nick assembled a team to investigate the death. Dr. Robert Green was in charge of the forensic investigation.
This could be one of 50 to 100 photographs we actually took on the evening. Poor Ken's body was in situ. There were some spectacles by the front door. Walking all the way through the house into the sitting room was where Ken's body lied. It was also obvious that a cord from a dressing gown had been used as a ligature, so that had been tied around his neck at some point.
Kenneth was beaten and strangled. And this is interesting because the majority of murders like this, strangulation isn't the usual method of killing that we would see. Strangulation is correlated to domestic murders. So it's a very interpersonal act to strangle somebody. And also there has been some research that says that when there's more than one method of killing, that's linked to premeditated murders.
Nick and the team very quickly built up a picture of who Kenneth was. Some of the information they received was very worrying.
I knew at the time when we were going there that he was a gun collector and a gun enthusiast and was a member of a local gun club. So we were aware that guns were likely to be an issue. And he had 24 guns, all legally held on licence. Someone may want to ask a question, or did ask the question, what is an 84-year-old man doing with 24 lethal barreled weapons in his house?
With fresh eyes the next day, the team got to work to find out exactly what had happened to Mr. Speakman.
You'll see in the picture that spectacles which were Mr. Speakman's were knocked off. You may pick up also the little green arrows. These identify other blood spots on the arm of the spectacles, and an angular spot on the skirting board there. So a blood spot that's come in at an oblique angle. So very much indicative of a strike to the face.
It's a very narrow entranceway. There is a small lobby at the inside of that front door there, and it seemed to me as if there may have been some sort of struggle. It didn't look as if whoever had been in there had been invited in willingly.
I recall going up the stairs, and in the main bedroom, which I assumed was Mr. Speakman's, a large number of gun cabinets, like gun safes, clearly had been opened. Some weapons on the bed, as I recall, some antique-type weapons, and then as a safe for what I assumed were long rifles. Moving on then into the attic, what was unusual about that was the fact that the attic room was a place where Mr. Speakman would make his own ammunition.
The search continued around the house, looking to see if there was any other point of entry or anything else that might have been disturbed. But the only thing we could find was by where the gun cabinets were in the upper stories of the house, where 12 handguns were missing. My immediate thoughts were, well, this is obviously a professional criminals that had committed this crime, because they knew exactly what they were looking for. And they were the short weapon handguns, and they're now in the hands of criminals.
Detectives had established a possible motive, but the question remained: who could have done this to an elderly gentleman?
There's always three people that you try immediately to eliminate. First, the person who finds the body. Second, the nearest and dearest. And the third, really, is the person who was last seen with the deceased. The daughter would have fallen into two of those categories. She found the body, and she's the nearest and dearest. So you always look at that. But I was confident that his daughter had nothing whatsoever to do with his death. She was an innocent victim, and obviously very traumatised as a result of this dreadful crime that had been committed against her father.
To understand the criminal, police first had to understand the victim.
Victimology is where you then look at the victim of the crime and their background. In order to establish some sort of motive, especially where you've got a cold scene murder, as in this case, it's important that you understand what is the background of the victim to develop your lines of inquiry.
By early morning, the local press were at the scene.
We had the story come through that a man had been found dead in a Ramsgate house, and very, very quickly it became apparent this was a major story. For a start, he was 84 years old. Whoever had done it had gained access to his gun collection. So stories obviously don't come much bigger than that. And then, of course, it turned out there was Kenneth Speakman, pillar of Ramsgate society, former town clerk, I think for 20 years. He's a very well-known man. This wasn't some sort of sordid death in a back street.
Mr. Speakman, although in his 80s, was pretty active and certainly on a weekly basis would be visiting his local gun club and taking part fully in the activities of that club.
The police had even more work to do to discover not only who had killed Mr. Speakman, but to find the dangerous firearms that were now on the streets.
The guns added a huge amount of spice to the story. It kept the story running. Indeed, all the time that the murder was running, the story was running. It just wouldn't go away because the fear was still there. That nagging toothache, there's a man out there with a gun, and is he going to appear? And where's he going to appear?
To be honest, those sort of weapons pass from criminal to criminal for committing various jobs, robberies, even murders, and in the hands of criminals I did not feel very well disposed towards the fact that we've now got 12 handguns in the criminal underworld, so to speak.
They are the sort of guns that appear to be missing.
"84-year-old retired town clerk Kenneth Speakman had been found dead in his living room and robbed of 12 guns from his collection. With not only a murder inquiry, but also missing firearms, the police in Ramsgate needed to know just what had happened that night.
As far as the motive was concerned, initially at the time, 12 handguns missing, I would think somebody who knew what they were looking for, knew that he was the holder of weapons that would be of great use and of interest to the criminal underworld, and no doubt he had been able to remonstrate with the offender, and they felt that possibly that he could be identified, or they could be identified, and therefore Mr. Speakman was going to be killed.
The search of the house had turned up few clues.
When we were in the upper loft area, where the gun cabinets are kept, we found a cigarette butt.
Through the camera lens, I'm thinking, cigarette end. Why would a cigarette end be by the side of this ammunition tin? We knew from very early on that Kenneth Speakman was a very meticulous man. He knew what to do and what not to do. He would not be smoking around that tin. I think then when you actually go, you look around the scene and you have to put the pieces of this jigsaw, start to put them together very, very early on. Why would Mr. Speakman's glasses be at the front door? Why was Mr. Speakman in the front room? Would he have left his specs by the front door? Why were there spots of blood by the front door? You went upstairs, of course. Why would the bedroom have been ransacked? Why would the upstairs, the attic room, why would there have been a cigarette end up there?
Officers started speaking to the local community. Andy Nichol, a detective constable at the time, was one of the team drafted in by SIO Nick Biddis.
The first time I met him, I think he actually threw 20 pence at me and asked him to go and get a newspaper. He was well known for being a disciplinarian, but it makes you hone your skills a bit. He was doing that because he had a duty to those people's families to make sure that he got the best out of everybody that he had working for him. Because after all, he chose them. It wasn't like they'd just been given to him. He went out and chose these detectives on his team. If they got it wrong, he got it wrong. I was part of the team that was brought on within a day or two after the murder. You wonder, who would have done this? Who would have done this? You try and think through the processes. Why would they attack a man of that age? Why would they kill him? I mean, he's 84 years of age, so why kill him? Why would you do it? Or there's a chance you would be recognised again. So it tends to give you that feeling of maybe someone local, maybe someone he knew. So they're going to be in real trouble if they're identified. So he's the only witness to it, so they've got to shut him up.
Initially, When you're confronted with any crime scene like this, you would be doing house-to-house inquiries in the area, speaking to neighbours, seeing if they could help you with anybody who may have been seen acting suspiciously in the area, or callers to Mr. Speakman's house, but that came to nothing. No one could help us in that regard. So as far as local inquiries and local neighbours providing us with any information, we weren't able to obtain anything like that.
The news of the Speakman murder, obviously being such a huge story, it spread, it snowballed, and yeah, so we got a few bizarre theories, but everyone was concentrating on the guns, and this was what alarmed them so much. There was a maniac roaming the streets, armed to the teeth, and people were wondering, are we going to be next?
With one man dead and a number of guns missing, detectives had to find a way to reassure the local community.
We're doing a lot of hours at that time. From a policing point of view, nothing worrying me other than I did not want to make a mistake. There were no CCTV, so it was good old-fashioned footwork. You've got to go and knock on doors and find out what people have seen, and it was really long hours just identifying who might have been where and who was around at the time. We knocked on doors and we rattled cages. That was policing in the early 90s.
If you don't get a realistic suspect within the first 48, 72 hours of any major crime like this, then you know that you've got an uphill task to find the offenders.
The killer was on the loose and might have got away, because obviously with every week, every month that passes, one starts to think that the odds are swinging slightly in his favour.
With no leads, Detective Superintendent Nick Biddis and his team began to ask themselves who might want the missing guns.
There's no obvious suspect that we can readily look at. My first instinct was to round up some of the active criminals in Ramsgate and the Thanet area to see what they were up to. We effectively arrested them, but all we landed up doing was proving that they couldn't have done it because they all had reasonable alibis.
In the meantime, the post-mortem report arrived. It painted a bleak picture of what Mr. Speakman had endured that night.
There were marks on the body of Mr. Speakman that indicated that perhaps he'd been beaten or tortured, as well as strangled, which was the cause of death.
The dressing gown cord had been pulled from this garment, and we think was perhaps part of the torture that was used on Mr. Speakman to actually get him to release the whereabouts of the keys for the gun safes.
With strangulation, it's not instant. It's minutes for somebody to die. You have to literally have your hands around their throat and watch them die slowly.
The forensic team led by Dr. Green continued to comb the crime scene for evidence to help catch the killer.
The rules of entering a crime scene can be summarised by using the mnemonic SCENE. The first S, of course, is safety, the safety of people actually in the scene. The C is for cordon, and effectively that means to draw a cordon and really to take control of that scene very early on in the inquiry. The E is where we start to evaluate what we have. The N is for notation, so that means that we have to make a very comprehensive, contemporaneous note of what we're actually seeing. Only then can we actually start to really focus on the evidence. So going through this in a very stepwise, logical, precise way.
During the search of the house, we came across a business card.
As you walked into the front of the house of Mr. Speakman, just to the right of the front door was his study, and ultimately that was where this business card was found. It raised this possibility of a business card that had been given to Mr. Speakman by a person who'd attended his address.
And it was a card which purported to show a man named Andrew Morgan and a local solicitor in Thanet. And apparently Kenneth Speakman had told his daughter that this individual had visited him because he was interested in starting up a gun club or being involved in a gun club and wanted Kenneth Speakman's help.
The immediate significance of that was finger marks. Could we treat this card with chemicals to actually develop some finger marks? Actually, we couldn't. There were no marks at all developed on that.
The company was a well-known, very reputable firm of solicitors in Thanet, so it was a genuine firm. So of course we thought, what's this chap had to do with this firm? We go to the firm and ask them, can we speak to this solicitor? We've never had any such solicitor. So this pricked our interest. Why is there a card, a business card on his mantelpiece from a very well-known firm of solicitors, clearly with a false name on it? Has to be something of interest. So it was felt that this Morgan had been to the house on maybe one or two occasions. So that became absolutely vital to us. Who is Andrew Morgan? He's definitely not from this firm of solicitors. Let's find out who he is.
In Ramsgate, one of the only clues police had found in Kenneth Speakman's house was a fake business card for a lawyer that didn't exist. They discovered it had been printed by a local company. DC Andy Nicol was tasked with going through the physical records of every card made on their printers.
It was a bit like an old typewriter ribbon, and these things would just move along as you printed each card. And I spent the next week or so unravelling these things, and then, blow me down, I got to one and I found 50 cards printed, Andrew Morgan solicitors, and it was the card that we had. So we had that, and that was a very exciting moment. We thought, we might be making some progress here. We discovered that that particular roll had come out of a machine at the Whitefriars Centre in Canterbury, and basically we looked at CCTV there. There were no cameras covering that machine, very sadly.
Police now knew beyond doubt that Andrew Morgan wasn't real. Mr. Speakman had been conned, but was the fake lawyer his killer?
The respectable status that he created was all part of the plan to befriend Ken, to get close to him. He knows that by creating a fictitious figure, he's less likely to be caught out.
Examination of the card didn't produce any fingerprints. The only other evidence they had gathered in the house was a cigarette end found in the attic.
As soon as I saw the cigarette end through the viewfinder, I was getting excited. I thought this is the key piece of evidence.
Robert and his forensic team were hopeful that DNA extracted from the cigarette end could match someone on the national database.
We took the DNA to the lab. When the call came back from the lab, that they'd profiled the DNA from the cigarette end did in fact have DNA on it. They'd profiled the cigarette end, and they'd loaded the profile to the database. Sadly, no match.
We're a bit of a dead end. They had a DNA profile of it, but that didn't throw up any suspects.
SIO Nick was running out of leads.
For a few weeks, could be months, you are still very much involved. But of course there comes a time when you have to scale down your investigation. You don't give up. You wouldn't in any way try to suggest that you give up on anything. But of course the lines of inquiry tend to peter out. Within a month, 2 months, we were struggling to continue with any viable inquiry lines that we could develop any further.
On the 2nd of February, It had been 3 months since the murder of 84-year-old Kenneth Speakman, when the police were called to a house where shots had been fired.
An incident occurred at a house in Birchington, which is about 6 miles away from here, and it was where somebody had entered the house and been confronted by the occupant, and in fact the intruder was armed with 2 weapons and another 2 weapons in a bag that he had with him. The occupant of the house was also a member of a local gun club and just happened to have a gun already loaded in his cellar, which he was able to get hold of, and then confronted the gunman who'd entered his kitchen and shot him 3 times.
We were working out of Dartford Police Station, and whilst still just clearing up the remnants of this other job that we'd been to, we got a phone call to say, get yourselves back down to Ramsgate in the morning. There's been a shooting. My initial thought was, what's gone on shooting. We then get a bit of the stories fed through to us from the major crime team saying some guy's been shot and he's still alive.
In a nearby field, the armed robber was apprehended by police.
The man in question was badly injured with gunshot wounds and was at one stage not likely to recover and would almost certainly be dead. But I was confronted with a situation where I had the shootout at the OK Corral going on. We had one man in hospital who was likely to die and another man ringing up, readily telling us he'd shot him.
When police arrested the suspected burglar, he was armed with familiar weapons.
He was in possession of the 4 guns. It was one of those that clearly 4 handguns, let's just check whether or not, and the serial numbers came back straight away.
The 4 weapons this man had on him when he was shot were from Kenneth Speakman.
Badly injured, the intruder was taken to a hospital in Margate. Could this man be involved in the murder of Kenneth Speakman?
Again, we then launch another part of the inquiry to find out who he is, where's he from, what's his background, who does he associate with, family, where does he live?
We found out very quickly who it was. It was a man called Anthony Swindells.
He was a man that only had 1 conviction, which was for something to do with the importation of drugs, and was what I might describe as a bit of a water mitty, really. He was a very, very, very strange individual, and he was the one that was responsible, obviously, for the intrusion at the house in Birchington, and we were very much interested in how he had 4 guns from Kenneth Speakman's gun cabinets at the scene of the murder.
Swindells was from Liverpool originally, Liverpudlian chap. Our inquiries into him showed that he joined the Navy, the Royal Navy, at some point when he was a younger man. That hadn't gone very well and he'd left. There was some sort of attempt to join the French Foreign Legion, which again ended up in failure. And he'd somehow moved down to the Kent area. We knew he'd been unemployed for a period of about 3 years. And he was just this very ordinary individual who'd seemed to have failed at most things, whether it be life or work or whatever.
We were dispatched to the hospital because, of course, we now needed a sample of a biological sample from Swindells to try to match against the cigarette end. Could we actually link him somehow? In hospital, of course, he was very subdued, but he had been shot, so clearly in pain, very quiet, very pale. A blood sample would have been taken. We would have sent that then to the laboratory, and we would have then asked them to do a side-by-side comparison. So not against the database, but the profile that you actually recovered from the cigarette end, does it match this person that we have in the hospital at Margate?
It didn't take long for the results from the DNA comparison of the blood test taken from Swindells to arrive.
I remember taking a call from the lab saying that they tried to provide a match, but there was actually no match. It didn't actually match Tony Swindells. So you can imagine we were crestfallen again.
Undeterred, detectives carried on with their investigations into Anthony Swindells.
We were given the task of searching the address of Anthony Swindells, which was a little bungalow. We were surprised that we didn't find the remainder of these weapons. Where were the others? We'd assumed, of course, that they were going to be at this address. The only piece of evidence at the time, really, was the sticker that had been stuck to some ammunition boxes in Mr. Speakman's address that were found actually in the kitchen.
It was yet more disappointment for detectives. They could find nothing to link Swindells conclusively to the murder of Kenneth Speakman. But they were soon in for a surprise.
I can remember the phone call from the laboratory, i.e., no, it's not him. You know, where do we go from here? You know, you're sort of, not in despair, but you think, oh, right, it's not him, but he's got the guns. And then they rang back.
We got a call back from the lab saying, really sorry, but this is a match. We've reanalysed the sample, and it is actually a direct match. So we knew, therefore, that we got a match with the blood of Swindells and the cigarette end, so we knew that he was the person who actually left that cigarette end there. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean to say that he was the murderer, but we were high-fiving. We thought, this is the breakthrough that we all needed.
So having gone from doom and gloom to really what I thought was a eureka moment, we were quite pleased with ourselves that at least now we could put Swindells definitely at the scene of the murder.
DNA had now placed Anthony Swindells in the home of Kenneth Speakman, but it wasn't enough to charge him with murder. They continued to question Swindells' neighbours, hoping for any information that could further link the two men.
We are just doing the house to house. Have you seen anything? Have you heard anything? Do you know the people here? What can you tell me? The general response is negative, all the way round. We had a long day.
The lady across the street from Anthony Swindells came across with a tray of tea and biscuits and got chatting about the case. She said, and by the way, do you actually know that he has the key for next door?
So we then get hold of Nick Biddis, explain the situation to him. Nick says, get a warrant. We get a search warrant for the next door neighbours. We try and get in, but eventually we have to smash a little window at the back door.
We climbed over the fence and looked through the back kitchen window of this address. And I sort of remember that the first thing I saw was a fruit bowl, a large fruit bowl with, there must have been 1 million cigarette ends in this fruit bowl. And immediately said to the guy I was with at the time, I think this is where all of this has been planned from.
We're now excited, thinking, well, Swindells might be our man. In the kitchen, on the top of the units, we can just see a piece of paper dipping over. So we pull that down, and it's a BT phone bill for that premises. And as we look down it, there are clear phone calls made from that premises to Kenneth Speakman's phone number. The excitement builds, and we're thinking, we are right. We daren't say we think the guns are here, but we're getting closer. We search the whole house and find nothing else, and we're thinking, this is starting to become disappointing. We get into the last bedroom, I lift this bed cover, and the first thing I see is a latex rubber glove. Interesting. Next to that is a little white suitcase, and next to that was a brown leather briefcase, which was slightly open. I just slightly pull the briefcase, and inside it I can immediately see all the ammunition. Clearly Kenneth Speakman's. Bobby Green came over. I then pull the white suitcase out from under the bed, open it up, and there they all are. All the Lugers, they're all there, all the guns, the lot. We haven't missed anything, they're all there, and it's a moment of gotcha.
And also what was found, the Brett's Book of Kent. And it's actually had a number of people of prominence listed in these books.
We think it really can't be possible. We open it up, go to S, and there is Kenneth Speakman. Entry, interest in firearms, in the book, highlighted with an orange highlighter. Bobby Green says, we've just found an orange highlighter falling down the back of his sofa. It's just like, this is coming together. It was a real good moment sort of thing.
You're euphoric. Is this going to be the final piece of the jigsaw? It didn't give us that final nexus between him and the murder.
Robert was still unconvinced the items found in Swindell's neighbour's house conclusively proved Anthony Swindell's was a killer. He needed more.
Just as an afterthought, just before we left the scene, we were sort of walking around and thinking, is there anything that we've missed? And I cast my mind back to that fortnight before the murder and said to a colleague of mine that the offender, 2 weeks before this offence, passed himself off as a solicitor. What items of clothing in this address would he wear if he was going to do that? Immediately your eye is drawn to a black trench coat in the hallway. We submitted that very quickly, of course, to the laboratory. And what the laboratory scientist was able to tell us there was that up the sleeve of that trench coat, there were airborne spots of blood consistent with someone punching. That takes you all the way back to that sort of first night at the scene, where Mr. Speakman's spectacles were knocked off, the blood from the nose, and the blood distribution up the sleeve. Of course, that was the final piece of the jigsaw. That actually put him being there and striking Mr. Speakman on the night of his murder.
We know from the way that Swindles created an alias and the way that he established a relationship with Ken that he was able to be charming. He was able to put on an act. And that's something that we see in organised offenders. The fact it was so planned and the fact that Swindles used strangulation and beating, I think, is a unique aspect of this case. He's watching him die in front of him. He could have just beaten him, but he didn't. He strangled and beat him to death, which is very personal.
It was everything they needed to bring Swindell's in.
Swindell's was still in hospital, full of holes, and was recovering. Subsequently, he comes out of hospital and is brought to Margate Police Station. And myself and a colleague end up interviewing Swindell's about the murder.
Anthony Swindell's then gave police his account of what happened that night.
He claimed that he had robbed Kenneth Speakman. He was guilty of that. He had been there, but he'd been with two others at the time. And he named them as Billy Toombs and a bloke called Emmy, or Em. That's all he knew about the other guy. They'd met in a pub somewhere, the classic, we met in a pub, don't really know them very well. They'd hatched this plot to steal these guns from Kenneth Speakman. He claims during the first set of interviews that he had then gone up to the loft and gathered all the guns and the ammunition, put them in the suitcases and the briefcase and carried them out and left. Hence the reason his DNA was on a cigarette butt in the loft. So he's putting himself in place wherever we can prove he's been. And he said, when I left, Kenneth Speakman was very much alive and healthy.
Swindell's gave police a description of the men he claimed had killed Mr. Speakman.
The description of Emmy and Em was very, very scant. The detail about Billy Toombs was significant and really, really detailed. And he then said, oh, well, I know that wasn't his real name. We said, how do you know that? And he said he'd been with him when he'd opened some mail to him, and it was a passport from the passport office, and he'd opened it, and the name on it was Brian Tomlinson.
With a new name, police had no option but to find out more about their new alleged suspect.
So the decision was made by Nick Billis to find all the Brian Tomlinsons in the UK between the age of 20 and 40 and go and visit them. So you think that's a mammoth task. We went to the Public Records Office, birth, deaths and marriages, and they basically assisted us greatly. And there were actually 52 in the country. So we then set about visiting them all.
Unbelievable. It was incredulous. Absolutely incredulous story he was giving us. Totally unbelievable. But nevertheless, of course, we had to go through the process of trying to trace these people. They didn't believe a word of it. We didn't and couldn't find any forensic or any other evidence to show that anybody other than the Swindells had been at the scene of the murder.
Anthony Swindells was charged with the murder of Kenneth Speakman. They had finally caught their killer.
There was great relief in the community when they learned that a man had been charged and was due to appear in court. And when the defendant was named, I must admit it meant nothing to me, as I recall. And I don't think it meant a great deal to the community.
Swindells went to Maidstone Crown Court to face the charges of armed robbery and murder. Determined to disprove his story of accomplices, police took some extraordinary steps.
We have to produce all the DNA from the scientists, we have to produce the cigarette, who found it, all the continuity, everything. What that also included was producing 52 Brian Tomlinsons at Crown Court. So we called all these gentlemen from all over the country to come down to Maidstone Crown Court, and they duly obliged. I remember being at the courtroom thinking, this is going to be mayhem. And so I spoke to the usher, who I'd known for some years, and said, whatever you do, don't come out and say, calling Brian Tomlinson. Of course, something had happened in the court, and he'd forgotten about that, and he came out and called Brian Tomlinson, and 52 men stood up. So it was just all over the place.
Swindells had appeared to be confident in his ability to persuade the court that he was not responsible for the murder of Kenneth Speakman. His legal team, less so. With things not going the way he wanted, Swindells pulled an old trick.
When I first saw Swindells in court, he was argumentative, I think. He was a little bit arrogant, and he didn't want to accept what his barrister was telling him, and he sacked him and said, I can do it myself, I'm going to defend myself. It was an absolute display of blatant arrogance.
The behaviour of Swindells all the way through this case, the way in which he befriended Ken, the alias that he used, and then his presentation with the police in the story that he generated, and then the fact that he sacked his own legal team, who were there to try and keep him out of prison, and represented himself, that all suggests that this is a narcissistic person. He's got an inflated ego. He's got confidence. He manipulates. He lies. All these things come really easy to him, which are all traits of narcissistic personality.
Nick, Andy and the team had done everything they could. Swindells' fate now lay in the hands of the jury.
He was found guilty of the murder of Kenneth Speakman, having pleaded guilty to the robbery at the house in Birchington. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation of at least 17 years.
When he was found guilty, some people might say arrogance, he realised what was coming. I just remember him being completely unfazed by the fact he'd been found guilty, and then was sentenced to life imprisonment.
I believe he's a psychopath and probably enjoyed what he did, was the manner in which he didn't seem to have any empathy at all.
This was an elderly gentleman with a very distinguished war record, given lots and lots of public service over the years. Someone's father, someone's grandfather. I hope that Kent Police gave the Speakman family some degree of closure, and that the offender, Anthony Swindells, was incarcerated for many years.
When the case comes to a conclusion, or in my case where you are able to charge someone, take them to court and get a conviction, it is a very satisfying feeling, I've got to be honest. You know, you're bringing solace to the families of the deceased. And of course that's a great satisfaction for me and the whole team. I mean, it's a team effort. Whatever else you say, these jobs can only be solved by a good team effort.
When a murder is discovered,
it was a female who had her head and her hands removed. And she had been found in what can be described as like a duffel bag. And she had her wrist and her ankles bound.
It doesn't just destroy one life.
I don't think he's capable of loving people, because how do you kill your own children? That was the last thing those children saw, was their dad killing them. How do you do that?
It tears communities apart.
When her body was located, she was nude, she was deceased, she had some ligature marks on her neck.
It's up to the police to not only solve the mystery.
I then went round the house looking for anything that might obviously be stolen.
And track down the killer, but bring them to justice.
There's 2 bodies found. Your first thought is, oh my goodness me, is there a serial killer?
In this episode, the body of a young woman is found in a ditch. But who is she?
So it was very shocking. It felt like there was something in the air, for sure. We didn't know where she was from. You know, somebody must be missing her.
Meet the detectives.
Julie had been drugged with ground down amitriptyline, an antidepressant. She had slowly lapsed into a coma.
Who reveal how they caught the killer.
He was a violent man and he was abusive to women, and he was a loose cannon.
On the 6th of July 1994, the body of a young woman was found in Lincolnshire.
A body in the ditch at Colby. It had been found by a dog walker. 9 a.m. that Wednesday morning. She'd phoned it in a few minutes later, realised the gravity of what it was, realised that we needed to be moved quickly on this.
Local Detective Inspector Neil Jones was on holiday at a caravan site in Yorkshire at the time.
I was sat having a meal with my wife and 2 children, and we saw this police car moving up and down the site. And I thought, I just had this little feeling, you just have a little feeling that might be looking for me. And it was obviously East Yorkshire, a police officer, who came and tapped on the door and said, we're trying to locate you. There has been a murder down in Lincolnshire.
Detective Chief Inspector Nick Howard raced to the scene.
First thing is to get down there, assess it and cordon it off. So I went with the DC and the DI, and straight away you look what's around. There's a pub up the road, there are a few houses, so straight away you can start house to house. Where this was situated, it was quite a clever deposition site. It was 300 metres from any habitable building. That road, you would never use it. Unless you were a farmer, you would never use it. So it was clever. The way it was done was clever and designed, I think, to minimise the chances of being seen.
Detective Inspector Neil Jones was appointed team leader on the case.
Arriving at the scene, I've been told that the body of a young lady has been found in this ditch down by the side here. Lincoln is just up the road. This is the small village of Colby. There's not a lot of traffic. I'm here purely to have a look to see the situation of where the deceased was found.
When a body is found in a ditch at the side of a road, the problems that we face are largely concerned with decomposition of that body. So the environment that it's found in can have a significant effect on how quickly or how slowly those remains decompose.
The area from Broughton, that end, up to the village is blocked off, so there's no movement along this road at all. Nobody can come down here who isn't associated with the crime. So you've got a number of vehicles, as I say, scenes of crime officers arriving, scenes of crime equipment. You've got forensic scientists, pathologists, all the technical experts that are going to try and give us a clue to anything that may be on the scene. The other important thing is we don't want to lose evidence. And out here, as you can see, with the elements, we've got to deal with this before there's some change of weather. It's very isolated. We're going to do a fingertip search. And they talk about this golden hour. That first hour is when things are really being pulled together. It's slightly different here because it's out in the middle of nowhere. So nobody's come through in the last hour. We're talking about the last few days. So we're going to be leaning on people, where were you, what were you doing, what did you see? And that's the most important thing, what did you see? And come forward and tell us what you did see.
The presence of so many police in a rural location soon attracted the media.
The call would have come into the newsroom. We used to call a thing called the voice bank, and their inspectors from police officers around the county would put on there any crimes overnight. And this day it was that a body had been found in a ditch in Colby, which is a village just outside of Lincoln, and police were appealing for witnesses.
On that particular morning, I walked down here, I actually just saw a tractor driver, and his instinct, what have you seen? So you just stop him, and immediately he was able to say, well, I saw a red van with yellow writing on the side.
The team had their first potential witness, but they still had no idea who the victim was.
There's no clear cause of death, that the body was naked, there were 2 rings on the left hand, the duvet had covered the body. Let the pathologist have a look, take a view of what could be done there, what must be done there, as opposed to what could be done in the mortuary. We weren't clear. There were no stab marks, there were no strangulation marks.
The most important things you need to do with a murder inquiry is identify the victim. Once the identification is complete, obviously that gives you a bit of a clue about what's happened in most cases. In this case, obviously, we didn't know what had happened and where. We knew she'd been badly beaten and she'd died, but we didn't know where that offence had taken place, who was responsible.
In any situation where a body is found, we're looking for information that pertains to the identity of that individual, the cause of death, and if anybody else might have been involved. In terms of the body specifically, we might be looking for DNA, we might be looking for fingerprints, we could look at dental records, dentition. We might also look at determining the biological profile of that individual, so whether they were male or female, how old they were when they died, how tall they might have been, and what ancestry they might have had as well.
Despite forensic analysis, the team still had no clue to the victim's identity or how she ended up in the ditch in Colby.
Spent probably 2 days putting dental charts into envelopes for the 17,500 dentists up and down the country, of which I think we got 4 replies at the end of the day. Obviously, the murderer, if you like, he's making his escape. He's not running away, but he's covering his tracks.
The post-mortem revealed that the woman had been badly beaten and had consumed a cocktail of different drugs, including a painkiller called amitriptyline, that had caused her to pass out.
The cause of death ultimately was proven to be aspiration pneumonia, drugged with ground down amitriptyline, an antidepressant. She had slowly lapsed into a coma, lost the cough reflex ability as she did so, and drowned on her own vomit. But that wasn't apparent at the time. So our thoughts were, we were confident it was murder,
there were enough drugs to kill an elephant. The violence that was used on her body, he bit her, he beat her. That is not the actions of a man that's made a mistake and panics. They are the actions of a sexual sadistic perpetrator.
Detectives took the usual steps to help identify the young woman.
We had an artist draw a sketch and impression. That was put into the papers. It didn't yield a result. So we needed something else.
Unhappy with the sketch, Detective Neil Jones then came up with a novel idea to get a better picture of the victim.
One of the senior detectives had heard of Vogue magazine's picture enhancement for models, so he went down to London with the mortuary photographs.
The art room secretary took a call from DCI Jones and basically said, "I've got a policeman on the line. He wants to talk to you." He'd basically explained on the phone that he'd got these photographs. They didn't know who the girl was, and they really were stuck as to how do we find out who she is. Well, of course, he realised that the only way to do that would be to show her photograph, and the only photographs obviously they had were a scene of crime. They really wanted to try and get a picture of what she would have looked like in life. He was literally in the art department within a couple of hours of that phone call.
Forensically, for me, the most striking thing about this case was the unusual route that the investigators took. The fact that they took the initiative and went to the fashion industry to get information about facial depiction and how that could be better used was absolutely fascinating.
The first seeing the real pictures was probably the worst, and then then you realise, well, you've just got a job to do, and let's do this one and let's do that one. You put your emotional response away at that point. I think that the body was found quite a while after she'd been left, and because if you're lying face down, gravity changes things, and the skin becomes very red and blotchy and physically changes. So we had to sort of ignore all that in a way and try and, certainly on the computer, to sort of smooth it out, and with the drawings to sort of ignore that side of it.
At the time it was ecstatic that they could actually do this sort of thing. What really was surprising, the amount of time that it took. This is not a 5-minute job. I mean, we got there at 8, 9 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock, and it was mid-afternoon before we even get to sort of this stage, and then it's another 2 hours before because every single little pixel on that chart has to be removed, replaced, and one of the right colour, and all the rest of it.
In some of the imagery, we actually found we managed to open the eye a bit, because of course when your eyes are closed, you look different to when they're open. So, again, that helped, and I think some of the pictures that were published her eyes were open slightly, which again helped to bring life back into the imagery.
The minute we got that picture, we thought, yes, this has got to be it. This has surely got to help and be the answer to this investigation with regard to identification.
With the help of Vogue magazine, a clearer image of the victim was created. Would the team finally be able to identify the body?
And this was the final image. Her features are obviously hers, because it's straight off her photograph.
And we got them into the press, and we got the breakthrough we needed on the 28th of July.
DCI Nick Howard received a phone call from a member of a local religious group, claiming to know the victim.
He was the head of the Toaster Commune. He was known in the group as John the Preceptor, at the head of the group. As is always the case for these things, you're wondering, is it a genuine call? Is it mistaken? But he was unequivocal and quite calm. He said, "I've known her for 7 years. That's Julie Clayton."
In Lincolnshire, detectives had identified the body in the ditch as Julie Clayton. But to help piece together what had happened to her, they needed to know more.
The first breakthrough with the Julie Clayton murder inquiry was obviously the identification. We'd covered the scene. As you can see, there isn't going to be too much to do here. We're doing the villagers, we're finding witnesses, but the most important thing was, where was this young lady from? Who was she? So we could try and link her with the offender.
It turned out Julie was a 27-year-old Australian. She had been living in the UK for several years.
Julie was an adventurer. As a 20-year-old, she decided to go backpacking and to see Europe. She travelled into Europe and she worked her way to the UK. She found people, like-minded people at the Jesus Fellowship in Towcester, people that she liked, they liked her, so she settled there. She stayed there for several years. She was happy there, but then the time came, she wanted to return home to see her family. She was homesick. But she decided that she'd use the rest of that summer to see the part she hadn't seen, the west of England, southwest of England.
She was a young girl who was enjoying life, travelling around. I mean, today, lots of young people travel around all of the time. It's nothing new then. I think it was quite unusual for a young girl so far from home to travel around in another country. She must have been a really nice, open personality. People took to her, and she obviously, probably was a downfall. She was clearly very trusting, wasn't she?
It's so sad when you look at Julie's lifestyle. She was over in the UK travelling. She'd been here for 7 years. We know that she'd been part of a commune, a religious commune, which I think suggests that she was quite naive. She was obviously searching for something.
It was people she met along the way at fairs. At the Strawberry Fair in Cambridge, after she'd left the commune, she met some vegans and she travelled with them down to the southwest, or agreed to meet them down there in Snostal. And then she survived by getting fruit picking jobs. And then her plan was to get back to Australia.
Hoping to learn more, DCI Nick Howard made the journey from Lincolnshire to St Austell in Cornwall and made an appeal to the local community about both Julie and the red van that had been seen near the body.
Once she had been identified, and then obviously we'd moved to Austell to try and locate her and locate the offender. This is the circulation that was put out for the red van. We didn't know the number of it. We know it's a Series 1 Mercedes Sprinter van, but no more than that.
We had a witness who actually saw Julie being picked up at around 9:30 on Friday the 1st of July. We had another sighting of her with a male, similarly described, about an hour later at a pasty shop in Lostwithiel. So that would take the time forward to around 10:30, 11 o'clock. Then they've come back, and the sighting by the witness of the bedsit was midday. So at midday, the witness sees Julie with this large guy and the maroon Mercedes van loading her stuff in.
The team now had sightings of Julie, the red van, and an unidentified man in Cornwall. They began to track their journey to Lincolnshire.
A red van had been sighted outside her flat. So what I did is had this on the walls, charts, if you like, of a timeline of what was happening with the inquiry, where Julie was, what was being found. So the officers had come in, they could see immediately where we were, which was the next step, and I'd also got some arrows of where we're going next.
So we think then they've made their way to Southampton, probably down the A303. We don't know, but we think that he's fed the amitriptyline to Julie in a spicy meal, probably on the Saturday evening at some point. The drug starts to take effect. She starts to lapse into a coma. Then sometime during that Saturday night into Sunday morning, probably at Southampton, waiting for the boat jumble to start the next day, he's assaulted her. Not being able to do what he planned to do, he leaves her in the van while he does his business at the Jumble, selling batteries, buying stuff for yachts. Then Julie's undiscovered. They make their way north on Sunday the 3rd of July, and that's when he deposits Julie's body in the ditch at Colby after dark, around 10 p.m. we think, when it would have been dark.
Neil and the team needed to find the owner of that red van urgently. He again reached out to the local community for any information.
I got a call from a lady, and I think her name was Tamsin, and she was at Falmouth. I went to see her, and she said that she'd answered an advert in one of the boat magazines to act as crew. And she'd agreed to go to France with this chap and crew his boat.
She had answered an advert he put in Yachting Monthly for young females 16 to 24, long days, fun nights, ocean-going yacht. She answered that. He recruited her. He met her at Portsmouth a few days later, took her over to Le Havre on a ferry, went to Honfleur.
The man who had placed the ad in Yachting Monthly took Tamsin to the boat in his red van. But what happened next really made the team take notice.
After a couple of days, they set off in the yacht, sailed into the mouth of the Seine, and it was one morning. She was feeling drowsy. We think he'd already drugged her, and she fought him off. He tried to attack her while she was in a sleeping bag. She escaped, got through she was a slip of a girl. She got through a hatch cover, dived overboard. It's quite wide at that point, the River Seine, apparently. She swam ashore, raised the alarm at a local farmhouse. They called the gendarmerie. They went to speak to him. He was a fluent French speaker. The gist of it was, it's a mistake. She's misunderstood my intentions. She's overreacted. They let him go.
This witness didn't know the name of her attacker, but detectives were already intensifying their search for the owner of the red van when they struck upon the idea of tracing the vehicle through the MOT test database from across the UK.
Based on the hypothesis, the person we were looking for either lived in the north and travelled regularly to the south, southwest, or vice versa, we thought it was a good line of inquiry. We started with Devon and Cornwall because we knew he'd been there, he'd been seen picking her up, and so we went to Exeter, which was one of the hubs, put in Mercedes vans in the last 12 months and worked back, and we eventually got to April in Barnstaple, and a Mercedes van of a similar description, owned by a person with a conviction for female abduction of a hitchhiker, immediately got our attention.
That information was sent up to the ops room at Lincoln Police Headquarters, and during the evening one of the officers would then do a PNC check to try and locate where that vehicle was. And the Mercedes van was identified to Dendell Walker.
Detectives had a name, known sex offender Dendell Walker. His description matched that given by Julie Clayton's friend when she got into the red van in Cornwall back in July.
He looked threatening. He stood about 30-40 metres away from Julie. He didn't come close so people get a good look at him. He had a ponytail. He was a big guy, physically imposing. He didn't like the look of him. He told her, don't go with him. But she said, no, I'm going to go with him. He's got an ocean-going yacht. I'm going to crew it to Malta, and I'll go on from there. So by then, he'd convinced her.
So she's desperate, she's got no money, and then suddenly somebody comes along and offers a way back to Australia. And I can understand how that would have been intoxicating for Julie.
Dendell Walker, he was well known in the sailing community down in Devon and Cornwall. He lived in a derelict boat on Portsmouth Harbour. And it was a wreck. A big, it just looked like an old sailing boat that, a galleon sort of thing. It was a real wreck. And he'd lived in there on the harbour for some time.
Now police had identified their suspect, the race was on to find and track him down.
There was a realisation in the team that we were getting close, but we had to be careful and thorough. And this breakthrough, you thought to yourself, yes, we're very close now.
In August 1994, a month after Julie Clayton was found drugged and murdered, detectives were keen to speak with their only lead, Denzil Walker. He had been tracked down to his mother's home in Hull, in the northeast of England.
It wasn't definitive, but it was the best lead we had, so we went with it. Went up to Hull covertly, found the van, got control of it outside the home address, and very quickly got a team up there with the intention of taking him to a police station. They'd arrived at the house while Walker was out, so the mother greeted them, allowed them to come in and to wait for her son. They told her they needed to question him about a case. They were dealing with a serious case, and they had to wait for about 20 minutes. He came back and he walked in. He had some flowers with him, and he bought these, we discovered, from a petrol station nearby to give to his mum. He was going away. We think he was fleeing because he'd been following the media, and I think he knew the net was closing on him.
I was down in Cornwall when Denzil Walker was actually found. I had identified his vehicle, and within a couple of days he'd obviously been arrested and brought into police station, and property belonging to Julie had been found on him, in his vehicle. We'd got a lot of work still to do.
We know that when Walker was arrested, the police found some items of Julie's. There could be many reasons for this. It could be that he just failed to get rid of them. It could be that he was wanting to sell them. Or it could have a more significant psychological reason. It could be that he was keeping a token from Julie, and that gave him some kind of sexual satisfaction.
Nearly 2 months after the body of Julie Clayton had been found, police finally had the man they suspected to be her killer in custody.
2 detective constables conducted the interview, and it was structured. Let them tell their story, and then start to put the challenges in based on what you have to challenge, undermine, disprove, to cast doubt upon, dispel.
As Walker faced questioning, he made a bold claim that he said proved he was not the killer.
At the time of his abduction and murder of Julianne Clayton, he would have been about 17, 18 stone, we calculated from the description, 6'2", physically imposing with long hair, unkempt, dishevelled appearance. By the time we found him on the 25th of August, he'd completely transformed himself. He was a registered diabetic for which he took insulin. We sought expert medical advice and opinion, and we realised that he'd, through a combination of diet and drugs manipulation, he'd managed to induce a weight loss of probably 2 stones in a short space of time. So by the time we found him, he didn't fit the physical description that the witness had given to us, and he'd cut his hair, and he was well groomed, and he used it with his solicitor, through his solicitor, to say, you've clearly got the wrong person.
It's really interesting that Walker was a diabetic, and whilst the police were trying to identify Julie, which took a long time, he changed his insulin to change his appearance, so he lost a lot of weight and changed his facial hair. This was his plan, so he didn't get identified.
Despite his denials, the evidence against Denzil Walker was building nicely.
He would stick with something until it was clearly not believable. Throughout his initial interview, he maintained the narrative that he'd picked Julie up. He maintained the narrative that he gave her a lift, no more than that. He maintained the narrative that he dropped her off and left her, and arranged to meet her again at Southampton, but she didn't turn up, so he sailed without her.
When the forensic tests from Walker's van and Julie's body arrived, the case began to look clear-cut.
So actually, with the vehicle, the van, both inside and outside, investigators would be looking for trace evidence again. So any evidence of blood splatter, blood evidence, any DNA evidence, fingerprint evidence, and certainly trace fibre evidence. So anything that might connect the van to a perpetrator or connect the van to the scene and to the victim.
It was clear that Julie had ingested amitriptyline, drugs that were found in Walker's possession in granular form, both in the van at the time and latterly when we traced the stolen yacht from Southampton. We conducted a thorough search under the water, over the water, and we recovered more drugs, amitriptyline ground powder on the yacht.
This crime was planned in some ways, in that he had the cocktail of drugs. He planned to sexually assault her. But it was also opportunistic because he just happened to come across Julie. So it's got elements of planning and opportunity. And a man like Walker, a sexual predator, he will always be looking for his next victim.
As well as the drugs, injuries found on Julie's body during post-mortem also connected her to Walker.
What was really important from a forensic point of view as well was the forensic odontological input, that dental information that came from the bite marks on Julie's body, because the investigators were able to match the bite marks with the impression taken of the perpetrator's false teeth.
As the team looked into Denzil Walker's past, their inquiries revealed that he had been a prolific sexual predator and had a history of violence, but never murder.
The fact that Julie was killed could suggest that he was escalating in his offending and he was fantasising about killing as well as sexually offending.
I think his plan was sexual gratification. I don't think he thought beyond that. He clearly decided when he picked her up that he was going to assault her. There's no way she'd have formed a relationship with him.
He wasn't a looker. I think he perhaps came across as a friend, you know, the sort of person that women wouldn't find attractive but could probably get on with, you know, as a friend quite well. And he was offering something. He was offering a bit of adventure, a bit of glamour, you know. Who wouldn't want to go and work on a yacht in Europe in summer, you know, at that age? Who wouldn't?
It was sexual assault was his motive. What he was going to do with Julie after that is a moot point. We don't know whether he'd have strangled her and murdered her, but clearly he was prepared to do whatever he needed to do. And he'd hit upon this idea of using the drugs to make her compliant, so that she wouldn't be able to resist.
It was going racing ahead, and everybody was getting very excited. But there's so much then. Once you've detected the crime, is then proving it.
The detectives investigating the murder of Julie Clayton had built a strong case against their prime suspect, Denzil Walker. Julie's family made the journey from Australia in the hope that her killer would be brought to justice.
It was clear they were a close family unit. They wanted to give Julie her freedom, but she was in regular contact with them. The last correspondence she had with them, her family, was a postcard she sent from Cornwall with a Plymouth postmark on the 30th of June, the day before she met Walker. And the message on that was, yeah, I'm about to set off. I won't be long. I'll keep you posted of my progress. There wasn't, as I recall, a detailed plan. It was just that she was setting off. She'd keep them posted along the way, and they were looking forward to seeing her. It was very sad, but I remember her brother I spoke to. They were quite dignified, They were respectful, they listened, and it must have been an awful moment for them. But they were able to come across to the UK and at least see where we'd found Julie and talk to us and get the questions answered to fill in the gaps to help them move forward.
DCI Nick Howard had promised Julie's family justice. Denzil Walker was in police custody and was struggling to undermine the evidence the police had against him.
So the facts of the case: Julie Clayton was murdered, that's a fact. That Denzil Walker was seen with her, that's a fact. His van that she got into was recognised as and traced to him, that's a fact. Her belongings were found, that's a fact. The injuries on her body is a fact. False teeth marks in her breast, a fact. The fact that they could all be traced to Denzil Walker, fact.
We know that Julie had been bitten on her breast, and in the investigation, the police managed to match the bite on her breast to Walker's dentures. This suggests that even though he's shown some elements of forensic awareness, he didn't think through that he could be leaving a trace of himself on her body. He didn't go to that level of planning, but also that was part of his sexual fantasy, and that therefore he wasn't thinking at that point. He just wanted to commit the act of biting the victim.
With Walker arguing against the evidence, Nick and the team needed to be able to place him at the scene of the crime.
The significant part was his alibi was undermined by the cell site analysis. It was early days, but the service provider said that it was conclusive, that phone was certainly not there, and he did tell us it was with him. It was a prized possession, so he wasn't saying, I left it, here. He had a difficulty because the phone cell site put him in Lincolnshire, not Southampton, miles away, so he had a problem on that Sunday. The rest of it fell into place with the ID, the two witnesses, the gentleman at the bedsit, the lady who he tried to assault on the boat in France. They picked him out, and so by that time it was all becoming pretty compelling.
After a 16-month-long investigation, Denzil Walker was facing trial for the murder of Julie Clayton.
So Walker, on the fourth day, was charged with the murder of Julie Ann Clayton between Friday the 1st of July 1994 and Wednesday the 6th of July 1994, which was when she was found.
In November 1995, Denzil Walker finally went to court.
So I went to court, and to my surprise, and I think the newsroom too, his solicitor applied for reporting restrictions to be lifted. So when this happens, what that means is that you can report everything and anything that's said in front of the magistrates' court. So all of the background that was given there by the prosecution, which would be as they saw it, the facts of the case, the fact that this girl was found dead in a ditch in Colby, the fact that Denzil Walker had picked her up in Cornwall, the fact that he was seen with her, the fact that his van had been identified, the van that picked her up had been identified, and all this kind of stuff, And his solicitor, I think, then stood to ask for reporting restrictions to be lifted because they wanted to appeal for more witnesses.
It was a 2-week trial, Nottingham Crown Court. It was a relatively short trial by standards. Every witness gave evidence, from the forensics, through the police, through the witnesses themselves. Walker gave evidence, so he went into the box. He could have chosen not to do that. Probably an illustration of his self-confidence. And his cross-examination was at length by the barrister, and he was unrepentant and pleading his innocence throughout and jousting his way through the questions.
Denzil Walker, all I can say is he's just stood there, I think, and listened. Or sat when he was told to sat. He wasn't misbehaved. He didn't shout anything, say anything, as far as I recall. He just, when asked to give his name, he gave it. And when told to sit, he sat, and so on.
And he at no time admitted the murder of Julie Clayton. The closest he came was he said that she administered the drugs himself. She died unexpectedly, and he panicked deposited the body. He realised he shouldn't have done that, but that was in court. That was at the 11th hour when he did that, when he saw that there was nowhere else to go.
Walker's defence is that Julie took the drugs herself and then he panicked and dumped the body. Everything in this case says that is completely untrue. The fact that Walker killed Julie could suggest that he planned to do that all along, and it was no longer enough just to sexually assault. He wanted to kill. To give somebody that many drugs, surely he was aware that that could kill her.
At the trial, he was cold, aloof, very passive, calculating, thinking on his feet. Never showed any remorse, never showed any emotion, just staring ahead and trying to manipulate, even then, right to the end.
By the end of the trial, the jury had seen through Walker's attempts to lie and cover his tracks.
The jury found him guilty. They weren't convinced by his story that it was a terrible accident, that he'd panicked and deposited the body. They accepted the prosecution case that this was a dangerous sexual predator.
Delighted, really, and elated is the word I was looking for, that you've actually got the right person. I know it was the right person. We haven't got any doubt about that, Saul. The evidence was overwhelming. And you've done a service to the community, and you've probably saved somebody else from the trauma that he's going to commit in the future.
Walker's sentence was 20 years life imprisonment.
The judge stipulated that before he could be released, he had to be of an age or of a state where he wasn't going to be a danger to other women, because the judge clearly saw that he was a danger to other women, that he was devious and a sexual deviant, and that he wasn't going to stop. He may have gone for another and another, you know. So the judge was probably right in his assessment that he would not have stopped offending.
It's difficult to know what to say about Denzel Walker, really. He obviously was quite a violent man. He obviously had this propensity to pick up young ladies who didn't really find him attractive, but he found them attractive, obviously.
I would say from looking at this case that it is very apparent to me as a psychologist that this man was going to go on to commit murder at some point. His sexual offending would have escalated to the point that he would have killed at some point. And I think after Julie, the fact that he did kill, he would go on to kill again.
The most frightening thing about him was how impassive, unremorseful and calculating he was. From his forensic awareness through to his mental strength to stick to this story of you've got the wrong person, and then belatedly, it was a terrible accident.
Based on what I know about offenders and based on the behaviour of Walker in this case, I think he's probably got quite a high opinion of himself. I think he thinks he's a charming individual and people are there purely to serve his needs, which suggests he's quite a narcissistic, egocentric character.
Walker was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 20 years. Finally, Julie's family knew the truth.
We're very relieved it's all over and that it's settled the way it has. It's helped us through the stage of our grieving. She did a great deal of good. She helped a lot of people who you'd almost call the rejects of life.
By identifying Julie and identifying then the killer, it must have given some solace to the family and some closure at the end of the day. They knew what happened to the daughter, a tragic death to a daughter.
My lasting thoughts in this case are twofold, really. One, a great sadness for the family that they never got to be reunited with Julie, and secondly, satisfaction that we managed to get justice for them.
He died in prison. I mean, you know, what more can you say? I mean, here's the thing, isn't it? Is it about justice or is it about revenge? If you're talking revenge, maybe not, you know, because nobody fed him drugs and left him in the back of a van to die and then dumped him naked in a ditch for anybody to find. So if it's revenge, no. But if it's justice, what more can you do but lock a man up in prison and deny him his freedom for the rest of his life? And that's ultimately what happened with Denzel Walker. So in that sense, yes, I think you have to say justice was done.
You always have to give yourself just a minute, stand by and realise what tragedy has happened here. And there's an awful lot of people going to be affected. Not only that poor lady in the ditch, but all the family around her, her friends, the people she's met recently, and she's suddenly gone.
Of real-life violence that some viewers may find distressing.
When a murder is discovered,
it was a female who had her head and her hands removed. And she had been found in what can be described as like a duffel bag. And she had her wrist and her ankles bound.
It doesn't just destroy one life.
I don't think he's capable of loving people. Because how do you kill your own children? That was the last thing those children saw, was their dad killing them. How do you do that?
It tears communities apart.
When her body was located, she was nude, she was deceased, she had some ligature marks on her neck.
It's up to the police to not only solve the mystery,
it was also obvious that a cord from a dressing gown had been used as a ligature, so that had been tied around his neck at some point.
And track down the killer, but bring them to justice.
The murder weapon was likely to have been something like a machete, a meat cleaver, or even a spade.
In this episode, in California, a mother, grandmother, and 3 small children are brutally murdered.
The hardest part were the babies, just being in there and seeing the destruction that was caused to them and just wondering why did it have to happen to them.
Meet the murder detectives.
There were 4, maybe 5 insects that we found on that radiator that could only have gotten onto the car in the southwestern states. And so by placing the car in California, we placed him in California.
Who reveal how they caught the killer.
I truly thought, okay, this cannot happen. This is an entire family. You're talking grandmother, mother, kids, 3 generations.
Bakersfield, California. On July the 8th, 2003, local police detective Jeff Watts got to work early.
The morning I got the call, I was the duty detective for call-out homicides. I was sitting at my desk. I thought my day was going to be an easy day. It was a Tuesday morning. We had just had a long 4th of July weekend.
Jeff could not have been more wrong.
I had sat down on my desk and I heard the radio traffic of suspicious activity and unknown circumstances at 901 3rd Street. I remember thinking that something didn't sound right, just the way the call was coming through on the radio. Shortly thereafter, I received a phone call at my desk at the police department that there was a homicide at the location.
Bakersfield has its fair share of crime. Gun deaths are not uncommon. Jeff headed to the scene.
I was looking at the scene from a standpoint of any number of things, whether it could have been a burglary, whether it could have been a specific, like a drive-by shooting, because I hadn't walked in yet. Initially, when we enter a house, when we know it's a homicide, in this case, fire department had been there, we were told by the original reporting party that there were supposed to be 5 people in the house. And of the 5 people that were in there, 2 were adults and 3 were children.
The residents were all from one family. Ernestine Harper, her daughter Joni, and Joni's 3 children, Marcus, 4, Lindsay, 2, and baby Marshall, just 6 weeks old.
I truly thought, okay, this cannot happen. This entire family. You're talking grandmother, mother, kids, 3 generations.
As the police began recording the scene, they found Joni, Marcus, and Lindsay in the main bedroom, all on the bed, dead. Jeff Cecil was the lead crime scene technician that day.
Each of the children had single gunshot wounds. Joni, you could see that some aggression was taken out on Joni. So Joni had multiple gunshot wounds, she had multiple stab wounds.
Police had been alerted by a close friend who had heard nothing from the family since seeing them at church on July the 6th, 2 days before. From the clothing they were found in, it seemed the family had been murdered after returning home from the service.
Ernestine, Joni, they were just completely involved with the church. They were very faithful. They would go to church starting in the morning on Sunday. They'd break for lunch, and they'd be there for the rest of the evening after lunch. Their routine was morning church, morning service. They'd go to lunch. That particular day where they were murdered, they went to Black Angus. And then the routine was to go home, rest, take a nap.
In the hallway outside her bedroom, Ernestine had been shot twice. A gun by her side indicated she had heard the killer and tried to intervene with her own weapon.
She had, unfortunately, some old ammunition in this handgun. She's squeezing that trigger. She's trying to work that gun. Doesn't go off. The bullets are bad, and they were corroded. But she did try to save her family.
This crime scene would have been so traumatic for the police officers who were first on scene. It was basically carnage. The scene that greeted those police officers would have been horrific.
I was only 3 years into the job. I had never worked a mass murder, as in this case. So it was one of those feelings where this is something big, and this needs to be solved. The hardest part were the babies. So you have very young kids in that house, innocent kids that were, just taking a nap. And I think the hardest part was just being in there and seeing the destruction that was caused to them. I have kids this age. And so some of the hardest part is just to look at these kids and in their stillness and just wondering, why somebody would do this.
As they searched the house, it became clear not all the family were accounted for. Baby Marshall appeared to be missing.
Once we found out Marshall was missing, we put a halt on the video. Everybody on deck start looking for this baby. Do we have a baby? Has it been kidnapped?
So I went in, documented the scene so that we could start looking for the baby. My main area of concern was going to be that bedroom with the main bodies. Another lab technician handled everything near Ernestine in the hallway, and then a third lab technician was documenting the exterior of the residence. There's a possibility there's fingerprints. We need to look for trace evidence. So if the person's walking around, they might have dropped some hairs or fibers. And then DNA, the invisible stuff.
But the only prints and DNA they found belonged to the family.
I started putting yellow evidence numbers to mark each physical item of evidence. So in my crime scene photos, you'll start to see yellow numbers. There was clothing evidence that was on the floor. That belongs to the kids, but that's still evidence to us that could have some potential value.
At first glance, it looked like the killer was interrupted while trying to rob the house.
See a computer that was removed from the bedroom and placed into the laundry room, like it was set up that somebody was going to take it out the garage and steal it. You can see things that are knocked over, things that are high value items. Back in 2003, a big screen TV was a high value item. I mean, maybe $5,000 or $6,000 for a TV back then.
But something doesn't add up.
Somebody is breaking into this house. Why wasn't the TV taken? There's money on a nightstand in the bedroom where Joni and the kids were killed. Large amount of money. Why wasn't it taken?
And it became clear, hey, this scene looks like it's a staged scene. Somebody is wanting the police to think that this was potentially a burglary gone bad. And it was pretty clear to me that this was somebody that was intent on killing a family versus committing a burglary and being caught in the act, just by, the very nature of what was seen.
As well as the baby, there was one other family member missing. Joni's estranged husband, Vincent Brothers.
When we found out that Vincent was the husband, my concern initially went to, well, where's he at? Is he alive? Is he outstanding? Is he safe?
It turns out Vincent was in Ohio, 2,500 miles away.
We were told, no, he's in Columbus. Well, let's make sure he's safe. Somebody's going to take the time to walk into a house and kill his family. They may be after him as well.
By now, the media had got wind of the case and were out in force. As news spread, it sent shockwaves through the community.
I don't think there was panic. I don't remember that being part of it. I mean, I think people were interested in, having the person brought to justice, but it wasn't a fever. I don't remember it as being a fever pitch like that. It was more of a fever pitch, at least from where I was coming from, of sadness for this family and just disbelief that something like this could happen.
The team had been at the house for 15 hours when Jeff Cecil made a heart-rending discovery.
I think there was only 3 of us in the residence, so after the photographs were taken, one of the detectives moved a pillow that was on the bed, and there was the baby, so the baby had actually been covered by a pillow. He had a single gunshot wound.
It was an immediate call to action for me. I mean, I truly thought, okay, this cannot happen. There was somebody out there that had committed 5 murders and was, at the time, scot-free.
In Bakersfield, California, a brutal murder of a family with young children had left local police stunned.
It's just something that stays with you. I think it takes a very unique person to be able to internalize what you see and keep it in there and not let it boil over and wreck your whole life. It's a tough job. It's definitely something that is tough on you. And your feelings are, we got to catch the person who did this, and we need to make sure that they pay the price.
Concerned that the killer may have been targeting the entire family, lead detective Jeff Watts needed to contact estranged husband and father Vincent Brothers fast.
There was a period of time during that first day, July 8th of 2003, that I wasn't sure if Vincent was a victim himself. And so we had put out a broadcast, a national broadcast, trying to attempt to locate him, check his welfare, and if he was going to be okay, let him know what happened. And at some point, he turned himself into Elizabeth City, North Carolina Police Department. And this was on the same day, July 8th, 2003. And my partner, Don Kruger, and I, we flew out that night from LAX on the last flight coming out. And we landed in Elizabeth City. And the first time I laid eyes on Vincent was in the city council chambers there. He wasn't under arrest, but he wanted to know what happened.
Vincent had driven from Ohio to Elizabeth to visit his mother. Now he had arrived at the local police station to discover why they wanted to talk to him.
Vincent's reaction to learning the death of his family, because I told him, I explained to him what happened, was that he started screaming for his mother multiple times. And when I tried to get his attention and talk to him, he charged at me. Not ran, but charged toward me in a very aggressive manner. And I remember thinking, you know, I don't know what is going through this man's mind. And so I told him multiple times, hey, look, we are trying to figure out what's going on with your family. Will you talk to us? Never gave us a statement. Didn't want to talk to us at that point. And so that was my first encounter with Vincent Brothers. And then he spoke with I believe it was his sister, and they decided he needed a lawyer. He wasn't under arrest. We were, at that point, fact gathering. That was it. No interrogation. Interview. I wanted information. I wanted to help him help with his family's murders. And that's what we got.
Vincent Brothers was the vice principal of Emerson Junior High School.
Local reporter Herb Benham's daughter attended Emerson when Vincent Brothers worked there.
He was such a powerful force at that school. Vincent would stand there in the morning, first thing at 7:30 or 7:20, right in front of the entrance, and those kids would come in, and they would stream in there by the hundreds. And he would look them in the eye just like this, and he'd put out his hand and he'd shake them, and he would make them shake his hand and make sure, and you look me in the eye while you are shaking my hand. And he would do that every single morning that I showed up there. He was there doing that. That's the vibe he gave those kids, and I think they respected him for that. They know who Vincent Brothers was.
But Jeff Watts had doubts. Unsettled by Vincent's strange behaviour, he reached out to FBI profiler Mark Safaric and asked him to build a portrait of the killer by working the crime scene from the ground up.
What I was being asked to do was to look at this crime scene, to look at the dynamics of the interaction between the offender and these 5 victim members of the Harper family. I'm looking at the level of planning and organization, of access to the victims or access to this residence, and then also how did this individual get out? So ingress and egress from the location. What happened to the bodies after the murder? What is going on in the crime scene?
Safaric began his profile by stepping into the shoes of the killer that day.
It was a Sunday afternoon, middle of the afternoon. It was a sunny day, and people are out and about. So this is not a typical work day. So people are out walking around, they're walking their dogs. It's a house that sits on a corner of a very busy street. The residential street isn't that busy, but the main street is. So again, this presents a rather high risk for the offender to offend at that location, especially when you're using a firearm.
Jeff Watts and his team had reported that the house had seemed very secure.
The house was well fortified. Wrought iron on the doors, wrought iron on the windows. Inside the houses were security bars under the doors so you could not force them open.
Ernestine kept dowels laid in the track of the window or the sliding glass door so that even if you could unlock the door, even if you could get through the burglar bars, prying that door open, you still wouldn't be able to open up the door because there's a dowel there. And the offender knew this.
He let himself in, removed the dowel that was blocking the slider from being open, went outside, closed it, waited for them to come home and take a nap like they always did, came back in, and that's how he entered and how he exited.
So there's no forced entry to this residence, which means that the offender had to provide access for himself at an earlier time.
This suggested the killer had prior knowledge of the home security, but once inside, he also seemed to know his way around. Ernestine was coming for him with a gun, but he got to her first.
Now, here's this interesting dynamic in this house. There's like this sliding glass door here, which should not be the location one would think to get access to Ernestine over here. The logical path, if you didn't know this house layout, would be to go this way across the family room, through the kitchen, into the formal dining room, through the formal living room, and finally into the hallway where he would have encountered Ernestine. But that's not the way he went. He went the shortest route, which is here. We know he came through this way because he fired several gunshots, one striking the wall, and that the direction of that shot could only have come from having come down this hallway. So this was a way that someone would come if you knew the layout of this house.
Jeff Watts had already discounted a burglary gone wrong as the reason for the shooting. That meant that the intruder may have come to the house intending to kill.
Ernestine had been active in being critically vocal about the local gangs in the area. So when you sort of place yourself in an elevated position of risk by being outwardly critical of the gangs, you can make yourself a target potentially for those gangs. So is her death and the death of the others related to this risk?
But the killer's attention seemed to have focused on Joni and the children, not Ernestine.
She was the only of the 5 victims that not only shot, but she stabbed too. That spoke to me a little bit as well. I mean, why are you going to shoot somebody in the head twice and then want to stab them?
In most homicides, as in most crimes, once the offender is done with the homicide, what we typically see is they leave. But we know that the offender covered up both Marcus and covered up Joni. Not only that, then the offender also covered Marshall. Why are you depersonalizing these victims? Why is it uncomfortable for you to see what you've done to these victims? Because you have a relationship with not only Joni, but with the children. So now who fits into that category?
When the police entered the crime scene to see the wife, a mother-in-law and 3 children killed, straight away that is indicative of a family annihilation case. So they would have been looking straight away for the father.
As Jeff Watts dug deeper into Vincent Brothers' background, he began to uncover a disturbing and tangled picture.
This case took 9 months for me to put together, and it wasn't for lack of, not having things to do. During that 9-month period, I put together a report on just Vincent Brothers' girlfriends, ex-girlfriends, lovers, ex-wives, an entire binder. I mean, a 3-inch binder. That's unbelievable. And we had to go through all of those women, made contact with all of them.
The women who'd been involved with Brothers told shocking stories of infidelity, abuse, and violence. A teaching colleague reported a sinister episode of stalking. Small wonder, Vincent's relationship with Joni was rocky.
Initially, they got married in January of 2000, and then they filed for divorce like a month later. And then they remarried in Las Vegas in January of 2003, if I remember right. The marriage was not good.
In this case, when we look at Vincent Brothers, we need to look at obviously his relationship with his wife, but also really significantly his relationship with previous partners. And what we see is a misogynistic, violent, domestic abuse perpetrator and a stalker. And what we know about stalkers is that stalkers who commit violence and harassment against their partners and other people are very dangerous. And they will go on and perpetuate more and more violence and potentially homicide.
Vincent Brothers was now the cops' prime suspect, but Brothers had an alibi. On the day of the murders, he was 2,500 miles away. Jeff Watts had to somehow solve an impossible conundrum.
I kept on trying to figure out how he was able to be in two places at once.
In Bakersfield, California, Detective Jeff Watts had hit a brick wall. After months of painstaking investigation, he now suspected Vincent Brothers had killed his wife Joni Harper, her mother Ernestine, and their 3 children.
We wanted to make sure that there was no potential other suspect. We wanted to make sure every suspect that could have been out there was eliminated, which left Vincent. All the evidence always pointed toward Vincent.
Following his police interview, Vincent Brothers returned to Bakersfield. Jeff Watts kept a close eye on him.
He was under constant surveillance. We weren't just going to let somebody like this run around town.
Vincent knew the cops were on his tail and seemed to enjoy it.
He would like to, I don't want to say taunt, but let the officers know that he knew they were there. You know, he'd ride by them on a bicycle and wave or say, "Good morning, officers," that type of deal. We had wiretapped his phone, or cell phone. He thought he was being pretty slick, and he'd walk from his apartment to the payphone down the block by a gas station and he'd make calls on that. Problem was we had wiretapped that phone too. So there were times, one time, if I remember right, he was talking to his mother, but he was disguising his voice, and she said, "Vincent, is that you?" And his response was, "Mom!" And I remember thinking, oh my God, this guy, he is something else. I mean, we all know it's you.
What we often see with these type of perpetrators is when they can get away with their using their superficial charm and they think they have somebody believing it, they will go with that. This is a man who's got away with things consistently all his life. So I absolutely believe that he was so egotistical to believe that he could get away with this.
The family funeral was held on July the 16th, 2003, and the community turned out in force to pay its respects. Vincent was every inch the grieving husband and father.
The funeral was at our convention center. I don't know how many people attended it, but there was thousands of people that attended the funerals. You're grateful that in this tragic time that the community banded together, and at the funeral there was, there's people that never knew these people, but they showed up and they paid their respects to them.
While the people of Bakersfield grieved, Jeff Watts continued digging. He decided to probe deeper into Vincent's alibi.
One of the potential alibis was Vincent's credit card and signature being used on July 6, 2003 at A.J. Wright, which is a store, and Walmart.
Then Jeff had a brainwave. He checked out the store's CCTV to see if he could spot the transactions taking place, and he found something unexpected. The man using the credit card in the video is Vincent's brother, Melvin.
Melvin Brothers had actually forged Vincent's signature and bought certain items at Vincent's request at certain locations, and then used Vincent's credit card. And that was all at the request of Vincent Brothers.
It was the first major break in the investigation. It began to look like Vincent had duped his brother.
Vincent's defense was, I was always in Columbus. I was using credit cards. I never left my brother's house that whole weekend. You can ask my brother and his family. They heard me. Well, it turns out they said they heard him, and then those statements later became, well, maybe I didn't hear anything.
The fact that Vincent was not in Columbus on the day of the murders didn't by itself make him the murderer. Jeff Watts now had to prove that Vincent was in Bakersfield.
One of the items of evidence was the rental car that he had rented once he arrived in Columbus, Ohio. He rented it from Dollar Rental. It was a Neon, a Dodge Neon. It was blue. I remember thinking, you know, we really need to go outside of the box. I mean, this man is just literally littered with alibis. And we knew we had something solid in the mileage of that car. We knew that the car could play a big factor. And we got to thinking, what evidence could show that he was in California?
While in Vincent's possession, the car had clocked up an incredible 5,000 miles, enough mileage for a round trip.
We sent officers, detectives, to every convenience store, gas station, anything on I-40 from Bakersfield to Columbus to seize videotape, and we seized it. And then we assigned detectives to watch hundreds of hours of videotapes to see if he walked into any store or parked his car to gas it anywhere. So that proved negative. But it also allowed the thinking of, okay, what happens if he picked up a hitchhiker, a insect, a bug while he's driving? Anybody who has an older car is going to know when they look at the radiator, look at all that dead bugs all over it, right? So I requested the FBI remove that radiator from that rental car. They removed it, they packaged it up.
Though he didn't know it, Jeff Watts was about to write a new chapter in criminal forensics.
We got a hold of Dr. Lynn Kimsey. Now, Dr. Kimsey is an entomologist with the University of California, Davis. Called her up.
If you look at the insects on this radiator, can you tell me where the vehicle has been? We thought, anything for a weird life. Never done it before. No one ever has. Maybe it'll work. Maybe not. We went over the radiator pretty thoroughly, you know, picking off everything and putting on clean white paper so you could see it, and then trying to figure out what it was. I'm the queen of bug splats right now, you know that, because of this case.
The painstaking work took Kimsey's team more than 5 hours.
She was able to, based on charting for us, show us where every one of those specific insects was confined to a certain area, a certain region.
There were 4, maybe 5 insects that we found on that radiator that could only have gotten onto the car in the southwestern states. Nowhere in the Midwest, nowhere east of the Rockies. It had to be in the Southwest.
So once we had that, and she was able to collect specimens, and she's an expert. The woman is an expert in her field. She was able to actually show us specimens of the actual bug.
We found a paper wasp, or I should say the fragments of a paper wasp, and it was another species of insect found only in the southwestern states. There was a true bug in the family Pismidae, and it was one of the things that's only found in sort of the northwestern Arizona, California, New Mexico. Very, very regionalized, but a slightly more southern distribution, because it has a very specific food plant, so it doesn't go very far. Then we found the grasshopper, which had very specific distributions kind of in the Four Corners area of Arizona, New Mexico, and so on. There was an additional bug, which is a Lygeid, that we found. It was harder to get specific information on that one, but it did put the car into California. But nothing we found actually put the car into Bakersfield. But we could put it into California.
I don't know the difference between a true bug and a regular bug, or a paper wasp and a red-shank grasshopper, but she did. And all three of those things that I just mentioned were on that radiator. And all three of those things were indigenous just to the west of the Rockies.
Professor Kimsey could draw only one conclusion.
If it's on your radiator, it means you had to encounter it in that place, which meant that even though the testimony was that he had never left Ohio in this rental car, he clearly, and since he was only the fourth person to, as I understand it, the fourth person to actually have rented that car, it was brand new. They could account for all of the other drivers, short distances in Ohio, and so by placing the car in California, we placed him in California.
Vincent Brothers was last seen in Columbus on Friday, July the 4th, and next seen late on Monday, the 7th. Could he have made such a massive journey in the time?
What we found on the radiator implied that the car had been driven primarily at night, because we found none of the common things that fly during summer months, painted lady butterflies, sulfur butterflies. None of that was on the car, and yet, if you've driven around California at all during the summer, and other parts of the country, those butterflies are everywhere, and you hit them, right? But we didn't find any, which suggested that he was doing a lot of night driving.
By driving night and day, and taking only a few short breaks, Vincent Brothers could have made his rendezvous with murder and still returned to Columbus in the time available. Detective Jeff Watts had enough to make his move. The net was closing in on family mass murder suspect Vincent Brothers. Detective Jeff Watts had astonishing evidence based on insects found in the radiator of Brothers' rental car, showing that he had secretly made a round trip of 5,000 miles to kill his family.
We thought, okay, we got the mileage. We might not have him on video, but we got bugs on board, insects, and something that he could have never got in Columbus. And we knew the previous three drivers never left Columbus. So that was a good hit for us, a good home run. I've never heard of anybody ever even coming up with that idea of looking for bugs.
The evidence was strong, but it didn't prove that Brothers was present at the house at the time of the murders. Jeff Watts needed something to clinch the case. His CSI partner, Jeff Cecil, had some news from the crime scene.
We found a glove tip that was just the tip of a finger, and that was found underneath a purse where all the contents were dumped out. So that was a unique thing to find, and it did ultimately have DNA on it.
When the DNA comes back, Vincent Brothers could not be excluded from being his DNA.
Vincent had of course lived in the house. His DNA was everywhere.
It could have been he was wearing them to paint a part of the residence. He was wearing them to do some work so he didn't get his hands dirty.
In this case, the importance of the glove tip was its location. Under a purse that had belonged to the victim that had been intentionally dumped out. That was pretty significant. And it suggests that he was there, not only the house at some given time, but it suggests that he was there during the murders.
After 9 months, it was time to charge Vincent Brothers with 5 counts of first-degree murder. But first, they had to find him.
My partner and I were actually going to meet him at an airport, at Los Angeles International Airport. He was scheduled to actually fly in from being out of state. And so we're waiting at the jet bridge of this airplane that's disembarking. There's no Vincent. So at the last minute, just like he always had been, he changed his airline flight. And it's just, I mean, that was quintessential Vincent Brothers, just constantly turning left when you think he's right. We drove back from Los Angeles to Bakersfield, and we found him. It was early in the morning. It was just after dawn, and he was walking to the community mailboxes, you know, the set of 9, 12 mailboxes that they use in residential areas. So he was now living in a gated community, in a brand new house that he had built, no worries in the world. And we drove up and we put the handcuffs on him. And I'll tell you what, that was the best feeling in the world.
The people who knew him were stunned. And the rest, well, even the people who didn't know him were, it's, you know, you're a vice principal at a school, you're a high flyer, who does something like that? So there was a little bit of disbelief, certainly.
After his arrest, Brothers continued to maintain his innocence. The possible motive for the murders remained a mystery.
I think Joni had really had it with Vincent and his, you know, seeing other women, and she just decided it was time for her to go on her own and was intending to divorce Vincent. But the problem for Vincent was he had 3 young children, and that would have meant it would have meant alimony, it would have meant then financial responsibility and support of these children really for the next 18 to 20 years. And Vincent just simply did not want to do that. He devised this elaborate plan to basically put himself out of state at the time they were murdered. So he flew to Ohio, then he rented a car in Ohio and drove straight back to Bakersfield, where he enacts his plan.
I remember sitting there thinking, this has been a long 4 years, because it had been 4 years from the murders to the trial in 2007.
When the case finally came to court, Jeff Watts had a ringside seat.
Brothers' demeanor at the trial was different. When the jury was present and paneled, sitting there across from him, he's very stoic. He would barely make any movements. He would just sit there with just a frozen look on his face. When the jury wasn't there, he became quite animated. As far as I was concerned, he liked to taunt the prosecutor. It was clear Vincent thought he was the smartest person in the room, anytime the jury was not there.
But come the verdict, it was a different story.
The jury went out and deliberated for 3 days, and they came back in, and you could literally see his heart pounding through his shirt. And he was kind of leaned back waiting for the verdict, and the clerk read the verdict, and the first count was read, and it was, guilty, murder in the first degree. He knew he finally was done.
Vincent Brothers was found guilty on all 5 counts. He was sentenced to death. The investigation was one that would stay with all those involved long after it had concluded.
So just being out here, it's a surreal feeling. In a 20-year career, I've seen plenty of other homicides, but I do remember this one. It really stands out in my mind. I don't think it'll be anything I will ever forget.
This particular case was something completely novel for me, and I don't think anyone else has any experience with this kind of thing either.
with this case, it was just... I don't know. It was just a very unique case for me to work. It was very personal in a lot of the just photographs I saw. One particular photograph, I had told the district attorney, I do not want to see that photograph in court. Please do not show it to me unless there's some huge need to show this photograph in court. I didn't want to see it. It reminded me of my own son.
It's one of the kind of the tragedies, public tragedies of my adult life, to watch somebody who was such a positive influence just, do this awful thing. Because I really believed in him. I just believed in it. I was one of many who I would have never thought it possible.
I think Vincent Brothers is probably a psychopath and deserves to be on death row. But in the end, is justice really served for these kids? Wouldn't it have been better if they could have lived their lives and if Joni and Ernestine could have finished out their lives? Of course. And that's, I think, for me, is always the sadness in these cases that, we get to a legal justice and Vincent Brothers will be incarcerated for the rest of his life. But what about the victims? Their lives are over, and I think that is always the sad piece.
When a murder is discovered,
it was a female who had her head and her hands removed. And she had been found in what can be described as like a duffel bag. And she had her wrist and her ankles bound.
It doesn't just destroy one life.
I truly thought, okay, this cannot happen. This is an entire family. You're talking grandmother, mother, kids, 3 generations.
It tears communities apart.
In this job, you see so much death, and people hurt each other, and just death and destruction and pain. You just get numb to it.
It's up to the police to not only solve the mystery.
He was a violent man, and he was abusive to women, and he was a loose cannon.
And track down the killer, but bring them to justice.
There's 2 bodies found. Your first thought is, oh my goodness me, is there a serial killer?
In this episode, a cold murder case suddenly reignites.
We began interviewing everyone, and that's when we unfolded the secret of one individual who had a penchant for violence for women and children.
Meet the murder detectives.
The group of victims continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger.
It was a very emotional time for all of these witnesses.
Who reveal how they caught the killer.
This man appeared to be a monster, and no one knew it.
In 2007, the Kent Metro Cold Case team in Grand Rapids, Michigan, reopened the investigation into the unsolved murder of a young woman.
Kathy's homicide occurred March 19th, 1976. This is the location of where Kathy Darling was murdered. The Grand Rapids Police Department is called to the location of Kathy Darling's home, in which the caller indicates that he found his female friend deceased inside the home. So when the police arrived, they went upstairs to her apartment and found her naked on the bed. She had been strangled, beaten, and sodomized at that home. And inside the home was her 14-month-old child in the next room. I do remember when we opened up that case. It was heartbreaking that this young 17-year-old mother of one who was pregnant had been so violated, and her family has had no answers.
The cold case team was set up in 2006 with the specific aim of re-examining a number of unsolved historical cases.
The Kent Metro Cold Case Team was a multi-jurisdictional team comprised of 3 different agencies: state, local, and county. It was set up because the Kent County Sheriff decided that we needed an unconventional approach to solving these cold cases that plague all of us in law enforcement here. There was approximately 180 unsolved murders back in 2006 when this team was formed. The expectation was we would work it for a little bit and it would fold. No one had any idea the success that this team would have.
One of the unsolved cases handed to the team was the murder of Kathy Darling from 1976. 31 years later, while revisiting her case, Sally and her colleagues made a visit to Kathy's family.
Kathy Darling's family was elated that the cold case had remembered their loved one and was going to try to find some answers for them. I remember sitting in their home with the brothers and Kathy's mother, and you could see the tears in their eyes when we said that we were going to do our best to try to solve this case.
The team thought her case may be related to other murders of the time.
In 1976, there were some real major issues in this area. The Heritage Hill murders, as Grand Rapids Police Department would call it, was a series of homicides that were occurring for young women about Kathy's age and older that were coming up missing and dumped on the side of the road or killed inside their home.
The team began their investigation by looking at events leading up to the discovery of Kathy's body.
Kathy Darling was a 17-year-old mom, mother of a 14-month-old, and pregnant with her second child. She lived alone here. She had a loving family that cared a lot about her. But Kathy was struggling financially because her husband was in prison.
His brother had heard that Kathy had been cheating on him while he was in prison. So he gathered a group of a few friends and went over to the apartment to confront her about this.
I think she was a lonely young lady, and she had a male friend, and she began seeing him on the side. At least she thought it was on the side.
On March 19th, 1976, Kathy's brother-in-law and 4 of his friends arrived at her apartment.
5 individuals come up those stairs to the back of the apartment where Kathy lived, and they pounded on the door. Her boyfriend is inside that home.
They smacked him around a little bit. He ended up escaping, and they chased after him. He ran into a local restaurant in the area and had them call for the police to come.
Grand Rapids police were called to the restaurant, and an officer showed up and took a police report and talked to the group and basically told them to settle down and told them all to go home.
The following day, the boyfriend returned to Kathy's flat to check on her and made an horrific discovery.
The leads back in 1976 when this happened were the boyfriend and the group of people that were the last ones to be at her apartment the night before. They did as much as they could back in 1976 to interview, to give polygraphs. They did submit some of the physical evidence to the State Police Crime Lab back in the 1970s. There was blood typing that was done, things of that nature, but it just wasn't a real exact science yet. They relied more on confessions, eyewitnesses, that type of information to help solve cases.
So the cold case team re-examined the evidence.
The evidence that was recovered from Kathy Darling's bedroom were a number of items that were clothing, bedding, the sheets that she lay on, objects that were used to sexually assault her. All those items were taken to our crime lab and were sent for forensic testing, hoping that we might be able to get something that would jumpstart this case.
So the ideal situation is that the item, when it was originally examined, has been processed in a way which is utterly clear, that the records, the contemporaneous records, are still available so that we can see what happened to it. The absolute gold standard of evidence is that we have the original item itself. That's been retained through the course of the intervening period. Now, if we've got the original item and we've got the original records, then it's very easy for us to sort of look at it and reevaluate it using today's forensic technologies.
It was a collective effort in trying to determine who caused the death and what caused the death of Kathy Darling. And so we utilized everything that was available to us, and unfortunately we came up empty-handed as well. But that didn't deter us. When we opened up this investigation, we opened up a series of investigations, specifically the Heritage Hill murders. The beauty of working cold cases from a multi-jurisdictional team is we can have up to 20 cases open at a time.
The team had discovered similarities between Kathy's murder and another cold case in their database, a murder that occurred on August 25th, 1979.
A City of Grand Rapids trash collection crew was helping police search for a woman missing since Friday night. The crew found the body in the weeds alongside some railroad tracks in an industrial neighborhood just south of Fulton Street. The victim is 21-year-old Diane Holloway, a postal worker from suburban Wyoming.
Right now, I'm walking to my sister's grave, Diane Holloway. She's with the rest of the family that's buried here. It's my dad and my mom, and my brother, and here's my sister Diane. Yeah, she shouldn't be here, but she is.
We knew there was a link between Holloway and Darling as soon as we started looking through the cases and the work that had been done by the detectives prior to us. We felt very strongly that both of these cases need to be cases that our team thoroughly investigated the best we could.
When the case got reopened, it actually felt good because I was going to find out more information on what happened and how it happened and who's involved and just the details.
Diane Holloway was a 21-year-old female, and this is the location where the police ended up finding her in 1979.
When her body was located, she was nude. She had some ligature marks on her neck.
Diane was last seen alive at her boyfriend John's apartment.
In the early morning hours, Diane Holloway got off work and was dropped off. This was late Friday evening, early Saturday morning. Diane went to that residence and met with her boyfriend.
When she arrived at his apartment, John was there, and there was also a group of men and a young lady who were there at John's apartment, and they were all drinking. So they had a small party of some sort that evening.
John indicates that he passed out in his bed. He thought that his girlfriend was going to leave and call for a cab to go home to where she resides with her parents. He went to sleep and never saw her again.
In the original investigation, Diane's boyfriend was the main suspect.
John was an alcoholic, was abusive, and her parents didn't want Diane around that. Diane also stressed some unhappiness with John to her co-workers, and that he had been abusive to her. And at the night that she went to his apartment, her co-worker who dropped her off there said she was going to break up with her boyfriend.
But in 2007, the cold case team highlighted another person of interest who was at John's house the night Diane was murdered, and who was also present at the home of Kathy Darling the night she was murdered. Russell Vane.
How unlucky is it for one man to see two women alive just before their death? Is that unlucky, or is that not a coincidence?
In 2007, the Kent Metro Cold Case team had linked two murders from the 1970s. They were reinvestigating the deaths of 17-year-old Kathy Darling and 21-year-old Diane Holloway.
When we opened up Kathy Darling's case from 76 and Diane Holloway's from 79, it was there that when we had a database that we were able to put together, that there was a man that was at both scenes that saw the victim alive in the early morning hours. That would be Russell Vane.
In 1976, on the night she was murdered, Kathy's brother-in-law and four of his friends, including Vane, went to her apartment to confront her about her affair.
Her brother-in-law was working at a gas station with Russell Vane that evening, and he had heard that the boyfriend was at his sister-in-law's home. He said that they were going to beat him up, that was their intentions.
3 years later, in 1979, Russell Vane was also at the home of Diane Holloway's boyfriend John on the night of her murder.
John and Russell knew each other. They both worked at the roofing company, and they both had just the same acquaintances, same friends, same group of guys that they all kind of knew and hung out with.
From the interviews of all the people that were there that evening, Russell Vane himself admits that he was the last one with Diane prior to her leaving to go make a phone call for a cab.
If you had multiple women or men assaulted and killed, if you have the same person there at the scene of both crimes, that's a pretty good clue there. That's a rarity in any cold case investigation or even an active case.
At the time of the original investigation, this link between the two cases was not discovered. Sadly for the families of both victims, the investigations were abandoned.
This was a time when they didn't have databases. They didn't have DNA. So those two murders were treated as two separate murders. So the police officers investigating each murder wouldn't have had a link to each other. So wouldn't know that Vane actually was the last person to see both of these women alive.
And for Diane's brother Bruce, her loss is something he still struggles with today.
What I found kind of fun with her was that she likes cars. She had a white, I think it was a Malibu, and she had it redone, and she was so proud of that car. She liked animals, and she liked people around. She's an easy to smile person. You know, it's, yeah, I think she would have made a great mother, you know, but we'll never know. If somebody's missing, you know, you can always hope for them to come back, but when they find a body, you know, that's it. You know, it's it. It was her. So it's one of those moments where your knees get weak. You feel like you can't get any air. You just don't know. You just want to hug somebody. You hug your parents. It affected my dad, and then, like, he died in 1996, and he never did find out who really murdered his daughter.
In 2007, the cold case team were making progress and believed the two women had been killed by the same person.
Both Kathy Darling and Diane Holloway suffered brutal assaults. As far as Diane Holloway, her body was concealed. As far as Kathy Darling is concerned, her body remained inside the home. But she suffered a horrific ordeal inside that house and also had ligature marks across her neck. She suffered the same fate as Diane Holloway.
Although the team believed Russell Vane was instrumental in both their deaths, they still had to find proof.
We start looking into Russell Vane of who he is and what he did for a living, where he lived. We did a timeline.
Russell Vane had probably a fairly horrific childhood. He was beaten. He ended up suffering from a lot of mental illness as a child and had multiple psychiatric incidents as a child. Our investigation discovered. He also, as he became a teen and into his 20s, began abusing drugs and alcohol.
We looked at his criminal history, and he had break-in. He had one assault case.
The team also reinvestigated the original suspects from both cases.
We also have to eliminate anybody else in these reports that may have been overlooked or have developed since that case opened, just so that we don't put the blinders on, because we want to have an open focus on this whole investigation, and is there anybody we missed?
The cold case team was able to clear numerous potential suspects in both of these cases by completing background investigations on all these individuals, whether it's criminal histories, checking for any other related type crimes, interviewing people around their lives, family, friends, co-workers, to ensure that there was no other information that hadn't been given to the prior investigators that could link them to these crimes.
In Kathy's case, Vane was the prime suspect, but in Diane's case, two suspects still remained.
The two people that we could not eliminate in this investigation was Russell Vane and John.
For a long time, we figured John might be involved. They were having some fights. And my mother didn't really care for him that much, which kind of put me on edge because I really didn't know what to think.
From the onset, the police focused on John because they focused on a person that would have had the most motive. Once they learned that Diane Holloway went there with the intention of breaking up with their boyfriend and then came up missing, you know, statistics show that somebody missing in this type of situation, you always look to the closest people.
The police were not comfortable with his behavior and his actions and his uncooperativeness at some point in that investigation. He refused to take a polygraph initially, hired an attorney who said that they were no longer allowed to talk to him. That's not a willing, cooperative boyfriend. So I understand the focus on John by original detectives.
Hoping to eliminate John from their inquiries, the cold case team interviewed the two other people who saw Diane alive on the 25th of August, 1979.
Initially, we talked to the young female and male that were here in the apartment when Diane arrived. And we spoke to them, and they had very little knowledge of Russell Vane or John, other than they were acquaintances that would drink together. But it wasn't until we started talking to family members of Russell Vane that we started learning some very troubling details.
Time is really a benefit in cold case because relationships change, situations change. Maybe spouses that had some loyalty to your suspect are now exes. Maybe the fear of that suspect is gone because they're either deceased or they're incarcerated. So the relationships and situations change that are a benefit to us in cold case that those original detectives just didn't have back then.
Every person we talked to made us convinced that Russell Vane is our person of interest, and the focus shifted from John to Russell Vane, and we knew we had uncovered a monster.
In 2007, the Kent Metro Cold Case team had made a significant breakthrough in the murder investigations of 17-year-old Kathy Darling and 21-year-old Diane Holloway. Their number one suspect was Russell Vane, but now they had to find definitive proof that he was their killer.
The main focus that we had was forensic testing. We wanted to use today's standards, the advancements in technology, in order to maybe prove this case.
In 1979, the police had collected clothing close to the location where Diane Holloway's body was found.
Her blouse, her corduroy jacket, her blue jeans were found at that same location. So it was apparent that whoever took off Diane's clothing discarded it all in one bunch at this certain location and hid it. There were obvious signs of blood on all her clothing. And when they separated the clothes, they realized that there was a cord wrapped inside the arm of the blue corduroy jacket, which was indicative of the same ligature mark that came across Diane's neck.
Evidence was also found from the house of her boyfriend, John.
There was physical evidence collected at the scene. There was a washcloth inside the apartment, and it had some blood on it.
Our first steps were to do a complete inventory of all the evidence and then do a forensic testing on what we had available.
While they waited for the results, the team shifted their focus onto Russell Vane.
He's somebody we really want to talk to. But before we talk to him, we want to know who he is. And the beauty of our team is there is no rush for us. Whereas the initial investigators, they're on a time frame. They have an active work schedule, and we don't. We're dedicated to these two cases, and we're going to take all our time that we can. And we did a full-blown investigation into Russell Vane. We realized that he was an alcoholic, that he had some violent tendencies when we started to talk to those closest to him.
It was quickly determined that he had sexual deviant kind of behaviors with numerous people, families, members, babysitters, friends, girlfriends.
Back in the 1970s, they may not have said anything about what Russell Vane did to them. But fast forward 30 years later, and these same little girls are now adult women and now being interviewed about what happened back in the 1970s and early 1980s. And that's when our team started putting together a pattern with Russell Vane and his behavior.
We interviewed every single friend and every single woman that was related to those friends. And slowly, one by one, each one described horror with Russell Vane from ages 4 to 30. It was heartbreaking because for the first time in a lot of these women's lives, they were telling a secret that had weighed on their shoulders forever. But it wasn't easy to tell the story because their first questions, all of them were, where is he? And is he going to come and get me now? It was the beatings. If Russell Vane said he was going to kill you, well, once they found the body of Kathy Darling and they found the body of Diane Holloway, their fears came true. And they realized he's somebody to watch out for. And when we knocked on their door and sat down and told them that we know about these sexual assaults that occurred and many women are coming forward, and if they'd been a victim, now's the time, because we're going to make sure that that fear goes away forever. And they were willing to talk.
What we know by looking at him is that he is a sexual predator. He is also an opportunist. So he will abuse and rape and also murder whoever happens to be there. So he's got no particular preference. When we look at his victims, his youngest victim of sexual assault was 4 years old. His oldest was 30. So he has no preferred victim. He is willing to rape and abuse and sexually assault anybody who is unlucky enough to be close to him.
Once we made contact with all the victims that Russell Vane had sexually assaulted, and they were willing to come forth, there was a good chance that one of them might hold the key to this investigation. But most important is when we interview Russell Vane's ex-girlfriend.
At the time of Kathy Darling's murder, Russell Vane was in a relationship with a young woman called Claudia.
It was when she woke up that morning and was called on the phone to say that Kathy Darling was murdered. She told Russell Vane about that. The key point to this is when she explained to Russell Vane Kathy Darling was murdered and what are they going to do about the kids, she was thinking that the murder occurred to another Kathy Darling who's a relative of the Darling family. Not the Kathy Darling that lives on Michigan. But Russell seemed to know who she was talking about and said Kathy Darling only has one child. She always wondered, how did Russell Vane know which Kathy Darling I was talking about that was murdered? And we wanted to know the same thing.
While the interview process continued, the results of the testing on the physical evidence started to come in, with one item in particular attracting their attention in relation to Diane Holloway's case.
The washcloth that was found in John's apartment, it was up on the stove, and that was collected by the original detectives. And it had some brown spots on it, so we sent that in. And the crime lab determined that there were some profiles on that wash rag that were human. One was Diane Holloway, and the other two were males.
It's the interpretation of the results that is going to be important. So if we've got, in this particular case, a washcloth, a piece of blood-stained cloth that we can now apply DNA analysis to, we can generate a profile from that blood and ascribe it to a particular individual. Now, in this case, that DNA profile matched the victim. So the interpretation of it can be really conclusive, because now we can say we've got something here that has the blood matching the victim on it. Is there anything else on that cloth that might help in identifying who handled it, who used it to maybe clean up or whatever? And we can now apply the technology to it, knowing that it's been stored properly in that intervening period.
Those two males we had to identify. We didn't know who they were. Whoever it was, why would their blood be on this washcloth with Diane's? So we needed to find that out. So the two most likely people, John and Russ Vane. We then requested a search warrant for both their DNAs. John was residing in Missouri and Russell Vane was residing in Cullman, Alabama. So we had to go to their court system in order to obtain a search warrant to be served in their state and county. And so we did that.
In 2008, almost 30 years after Diane's murder, the team travelled to Missouri, the home of her former boyfriend, John.
When we interviewed John in Missouri, we ended up interviewing him actually in a car. And I think he provided more information than he ever probably had before. He was obviously, throughout our investigation, was very upset about the death of Diane Holloway.
They also travelled to Alabama, the home of Russell Vane.
When Sally and I went to his residence, he completely had no idea who we were. We really came unannounced, like nobody knew we were coming. We traveled to Alabama and just knocked on his door.
When he opened up his door, he was a very frail-looking man, obviously not in good health. When we told him we were there for a murder, you would think that one would say, why do you want to talk to me? He had no questions like that. He was just willing to come with us. And so he rode along with us to the police department, very cooperative. Enough that when I explained who we were and we were from Michigan, he urinated on himself.
In 2008, the Kent Metro Cold Case team were closing in on their prime suspect, Russell Vane, for the murders of Kathy Darling and Diane Holloway. When they collected a sample of his DNA, they also conducted an interview.
One of the things that I recall Russell talking about his involvement is that he confessed that he was the last person to see Diane Holloway and Kathy Darling. He admitted that he was there at both scenes, and probably how unlucky for him. He also tried to downplay his behavior back in those days.
There were a lot of things that he would just push aside and try to blame on the fact that he was a drunk and that he would black out and that his memory wasn't very good because of the lifestyle that he led when he was younger.
I think the shocking element of this whole case is that here we are trying to solve two murders, and we find that they're connected by one person, and then uncovering 20 additional sexual assaults that went unreported throughout this whole era. What a coward. Because he preyed on young, weak women and children. His encounters were never with men, they were with women. And how sad that that had to be, because he destroyed every single one of their lives. And it appeared that it didn't affect him. I was disgusted, but I had to put on a strong face and not show my emotion.
The team then sent the DNA of John and Russell Vane to the lab for profiling. Although Diane Holloway's DNA had been identified on the washcloth, the odds of matching the two remaining profiles was slim.
The original case happened in the 70s, so the strategy that they applied wouldn't necessarily apply today. because they might have been walking around scenes without wearing any personal protective equipment. They wouldn't have been necessarily thinking, I mustn't contaminate this item with DNA, because they didn't know that DNA was going to be on the table a number of years later. So cold case review can be really tricky, and it's possible that DNA analysis simply cannot help because there is so much uncertainty about how that item was initially recovered, how it was dealt with when it was initially examined, and whether or not there's any opportunity that the DNA that you're now looking at was put there during the life of the case.
After an excruciating wait, the results came back.
Russell Vane could not be excluded as being a person who deposited DNA on that washcloth that had Diane Holloway's DNA on it.
They also couldn't say definitively, this is Russell Vane's DNA. So it's kind of in the middle. It's degraded to the point where they can't say 100% this is him. They also can't say, we're going to say his DNA is completely not on this piece of evidence.
Although promising, this wasn't the breakthrough the cold case team had been hoping for. Without a definitive DNA match, there wasn't enough to arrest Vane for murder. However, the team did have enough evidence to charge him with sexual assault.
After 2 years of talking to all these victims, we were going to write an arrest warrant for Russell Vane for 5 of those rapes that we uncovered.
We flew to Alabama with the intent of serving an arrest warrant on him and a search warrant on his residence. He was brought to the police department, advised he was under arrest, advised of his rights, and interviewed at the police department in that location. Russell Vane acted the same way he always acted, fairly calm and cool. He never seemed to get upset at really much any point during the course of this investigation.
The team decided to request a preliminary hearing.
A preliminary hearing is a probable cause hearing to show the judge the type of case that you have and whether or not there is enough evidence to take this to trial. We decided to use that preliminary hearing almost like a full-blown trial. It lasted over 5 days.
All the sexual assault victims were brought in to testify. Highly unusual to do that, but we wanted to secure their testimony for fear that they changed their mind and didn't want to testify against this monster. But all of them did. And so they testified about the brutal rapes that they endured.
During the hearing, the prosecution also showed key pieces of evidence to the witnesses, among them the rope that was used to kill Diane Holloway.
We tried to identify where that cord came from, knowing that that was the murder weapon. And we had great difficulty. We sent that to the FBI crime lab, who did an analysis. There was no physical evidence on that cord, and there was nothing to determine where it came from, only the type of material it was made of.
Little did they know that when Russell Vane's ex-partner Claudia took the stand, things would take a dramatic turn.
You can only imagine our surprise when she is at the preliminary hearing and our prosecutor holds up that rope and shows it to Claudia just in an attempt to see if it would trigger any memory. Claudia got up and ran out of the courtroom. I ran out into the hallway to try to find Claudia, and she was in a panic. And so I ended up taking her into a back room and I said, Claudia, what's going on? And she explained that that rope was hers, that she worked at a factory where they would stack tires. And in order to secure the tires in an upright position, they secured it with these binders of ropes. She said at the time she was pregnant. She didn't have maternity clothes. And so she had to wear pants with the zipper and the button undone and open. And her pants would fall down. So one day she decided to cut that rope. and use it as a belt. And it wasn't until our prosecutor pulled that rope up in the preliminary hearing that she recalled where that was from and knew if that is what was used to strangle Diane Holloway, Russell Vane took that from their home.
Once Russell Vane heard the testimony of Claudia, who identified the ligature that was used to kill Diane Holloway, I think Russell Vane knew that the police knew his involvement and that a jury would find him guilty as well. And so he opted to take a plea and not go further with any criminal trial.
Vane decided to take a deal where he pleaded guilty to the 1976 murder of 17-year-old Kathy Darling and the 1979 murder of 21-year-old Diane Holloway in exchange for dropping the sexual assault charges.
He sentenced Russell Vane to life in prison for the murder of Diane Holloway and 35 to 90 years for Kathy Darling. That's a life sentence for Russell Vane, and that will ensure that he'll never get out of prison. The sexual assault charges were dropped, and we asked the assault victims if they were okay with that, and they all were.
As we see with many of these types of murders, there was domestic violence in the background of Vane, and many of the victims that have come forward since those murders were committed in the 70s have said how violent he was. So the fact that there's not more murder victims is just probably by luck, because he very nearly killed many women.
I'll always remember the fact that these people were able to be brave enough to get up on the stand in a courtroom and testify against him to ensure that he wouldn't be allowed to be out for the rest of his life.
That made me feel better that my mother had also more closure. That was good. It really was. Even after 30 years, it made her feel better and made me feel better, and it was a win-win for us.
When Vane was convicted and sentenced, it is what every detective waits for. All your hard work, all the emotions put into it, all is a result of that. And this is what we look for. It's the greatest reward you can give us.